You are listening to Ratlines, The Hunt for Nazi War Criminals, Episode 1, written and narrated by Mark Felton. This is an audio episode for War Stories with Mark Felton. SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Stangl was a man who was waiting to be exposed. It seemed almost inevitable, as he had the blood of 800,000 Jews on his hands. Between August 1942 and August 1943, Stangl had been the commandant of Treblinka death camp in Poland. Stangl bore command responsibility for the deaths that had occurred whilst he had been running Treblinka. Previously, Stangl had commanded the Sobibor extermination camp, where another 100,000 Jews had perished during his period in command. By the summer of 1945, Stangl, in common with many other Nazis, had taken refuge in the Austrian Alps, among the last area overrun by the advancing Allies. The small, pretty villages were crammed with former SS men, all of whom were hoping against hope that they might avoid arrest as the US Army moved into the vacuum created by the German surrender. Within days, American patrols were sweeping the valleys in their search for high-ranking Nazi war crime suspects. Stangl, who was 37 years old at the time, was hiding in the home of an Austrian policeman and family friend in the village of Altersee. Also in Altersee, at the same time, was SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, Reinhard Heydrich's deputy until his assassination in 1942, and the man who was directly responsible for implementing the final solution. Eichmann was the archetypal Nazi bureaucrat, a slight, balding and physically rather unimpressive man, but a man born to follow orders and a fervent National Socialist. When the Germans had taken over Hungary in 1944, it was Eichmann who had personally issued the orders to ship 400,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Alongside Stangl and Eichmann in Altersee was a veritable who's who of wanted Nazi war criminals, including Heydrich's successor, the Reich Main Security Office, and Eichmann's boss, the monstrously tall, scar-faced Austrian giant, Dr. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. The other Nazis asked Eichmann to leave, believing him to be the greatest prize for the searching Allies, one SS officer describing Eichmann as the personification of all the crimes they had jointly committed. Leaving his wife Vera and their 3 sons in his uncle's villa in the village, Eichmann, who was armed with a machine pistol, headed up into the mountains with a small group of fellow SS officers, where they intended to fight it out with the Americans rather than be captured. They lived initially in a quiet, secluded inn, but then moved into an even more remote valley. There, the other SS decided to cut Eichmann loose, and with only his adjutant, Obersturmführer Rudolf Jenisch, for company, Eichmann headed north. They sensibly discarded their SS uniforms and disguised themselves as a pair of Luftwaffe NCOs for the journey. If Adolf Eichmann's name had appeared on the order that had condemned millions to a cruel death, Franz Stangl bore the responsibility of having operated the death factories of the final solution. He had originally been a police officer before joining the SS. In 1940, on the direct orders of Himmler, Stangl had become the superintendent of the T4 euthanasia program that was based at Schloss Hartheim in Austria. This was the bloody prelude to the mass murders that were to follow. The mentally retarded and physically disabled were murdered at the Hartheim institution on the recommendations of doctors, as the Nazis attempted to remove all, quote, defectives, unquote, from their population. Initially hesitant of associating himself with the murder program, Stangl had been soothed by reassurances from his superiors, and somewhat surprisingly from Roman Catholic priests and nuns, who themselves had recommended that some of their own parishioners be put to death. Over 70,000 patients were to die over the course of the T4 program, which continued in operation until just after the war ended in 1945. Told that the killings were the responsibility of doctors, Stangl had set aside his moral reservations and done his duty as he conceived of it. No fanatic, Stangl always maintained that he was merely a policeman doing his job, writes Guy Walters in Hunting Evil. If anybody embodied the banality of evil, it was Stangl. From the gloomy Schloss Hartheim, Stangl had progressed to a crucial role in Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to rid Poland of its Jews once and for all. Franz Stangl was soon arrested by an American patrol. He suspected that his police officer host had betrayed him to the Americans, and he was taken to a prison at Bad Ischl. Under a standard American interrogation, Stangl admitted that he had been an SS officer, but he did not mention either the T4 program or his involvement in Operation Reinhard. Instead, he told the Americans that he had been employed on anti-partisan duties in Italy and Yugoslavia. And he was convincing enough that his interrogators believed him. Stangl had served in the region after the conclusion of Reinhard, so he was able to speak from experience. The Americans believed Stangl to be harmless, and they transferred him to Glasenbach prisoner of war camp just south of Salzburg in July 1945. At Glasenbach, Stangl became just another prisoner among 20,000 former German servicemen. Conditions were rough and ready inside the camp, but he was able to see his wife, and after a few months the living conditions began to improve, along with the food. Adolf Eichmann remained on the loose, while Stangl cooled his heels in a prison camp. Eichmann and his adjutant Jenisch headed to Salzburg. From there they continued north into Germany. After several close shaves, Eichmann was eventually captured after an American patrol found his blood group tattooed under his left arm, as had been the SS requirement. When confronted with this evidence, Eichmann admitted that he was a cavalry officer by the name of SS Untersturmführer Otto Eckmann. He carefully chose the name Eichmann because of its similarity to his real name, so that if anyone recognized him in a camp and called him by his real name, the Americans probably would not catch on. Eichmann was processed through several prison camps, fearing all the while that he would be exposed. Things began to become uncomfortable for him in January 1946, when barely 30 miles away from his camp, the Nuremberg trials were in full swing. His name was repeated over and over during the cross-questioning of one of his former subordinates, SS Hauptsturmführer Dieter Witzlitzny, who was determined to save his own neck by fully cooperating with the tribunal. Eichmann's role as the administrator of the Holocaust was revealed in full to the court. Eichmann soon discovered what had been said as news spread fast among the POWs, and in fear he revealed his true identity to several SS officers in the camp. Although Eichmann was about as popular as a dose of the plague, the SS officers agreed to help him, and on the 5th of February 1946, Eichmann escaped from the camp carrying forged papers in the name of Otto Henninger. Eichmann immediately headed 200 miles south to the Bavarian town of Prien, where he hid out in the sister's house of an SS sergeant that he had been imprisoned with. At the time, Eichmann was only 5 miles away from another major war criminal, Dr. Josef Mengele, who was working as a farm laborer in the village of Mangolding. The number of U.S. Army patrols in the area soon convinced Eichmann that it was time to move on, and he found work through SS contacts as a forester in the village of Eversen, close to Hamburg in northern Germany. Eichmann would stay out of sight in Eversen for the next 3 years, biding his time until he could flee the country. Franz Stangl sat it out at Glasenbach POW camp until the summer of 1947, when the Austrians began to investigate the T4 euthanasia program. It was only a matter of time before Stangl's name came up, and he was moved to a prison in Linz to await trial. The Austrians made the mistake of transferring Stangl to an open prison, but they knew nothing at that stage of his involvement in Operation Reinhard. At the open prison, Stangl even enjoyed conjugal visits from his wife. It was his wife, Theresa, who persuaded Stangl to escape from Linz after a driver from Schloss Hartheim was given a 4-year prison sentence for his minor part in the euthanasia program. Obviously, Stangl, as the former superintendent, would be locked away for a considerable amount of time. On the 30th of May 1948, Stangl, in company with another prisoner named Hans Steiner, escaped from Linz. Theresa Stangl had given her husband some cash and jewellery, and Stangl had collected together some canned goods for the journey. Their first destination was the city of Graz, 130 miles to the west. The two men walked all of the way to Graz to save money. Another war criminal and former camp commandant who had headed for Graz was Eduard Roschmann, who had been appointed the commandant of the Riga ghetto in Latvia in January 1943. It was a dangerous city for a Nazi fugitive to visit, and the British were laying in wait for Roschmann. Roschmann came from a good family, the son of a brewery manager in the Austrian city of Graz. Born in 1908, Roschmann was too young to serve in the First World War, but his attraction to uniforms and military discipline was served by his joining a section of the Austrian Home Guard in 1927 that was called the Fatherland's Front. After university, where the young Roschmann had trained as a lawyer, he had worked in a brewery, gravitating next to the civil service in 1935. Following the German Anschluss, or takeover of Austria in 1938, Roschmann had joined the Nazi Party, which had been up to that time an illegal organization. The following year, Roschmann had donned the uniform of the SS for the first time. And by the time war was being contemplated against the Soviet Union, Roschmann was working for Reinhard Heydrich's RSHA, the office that oversaw all of the security organs of the Nazi state. Roschmann, the bureaucrat, was serving in the Sicherheitspolizei, or security police, when he was assigned in January 1941 to the Sicherheitsdienst, the dreaded SD. From there, he joined SD Department 4, the Gestapo, and was placed under the command of the security police and SD in occupied Latvia. The Jewish population of Latvia was almost entirely eliminated in one of the worst mass executions in history, and Roschmann played his part in the murders. A large ghetto had been created in Riga by the Germans, and basically a section of the city had been segregated by barbed wire fences and armed guards, and the nation's Jews crammed into the resulting camp. On the 30th of November, and again on the 8th of December 1941, the Nazis had emptied most of the Jews out of the large ghetto and force-marched them out of the city to the nearby forest of Rumbala. There they were shot in large groups, 24,000 men, women and children being put to death. It was, after the WWII massacre on the Eastern Front, the second largest mass shooting conducted by German forces during the Second World War. Only a few thousand Latvian Jews were spared. The SD then created 3 ghettos in Riga. The first was the men's ghetto. The second housed 500 female Jews and was called the women's ghetto. The last was much larger and was filled with German, Austrian and Czech Jews who were shipped to Riga on cattle trains. This area was known as the German ghetto. In March 1942 there was another mass shooting action in which Roschmann was involved, not as a murderer but as an administrator whose job was to select likely victims from the population of the German ghetto. Those selected were merged with a group of Jews from the Jungfernhof concentration camp outside Riga. In a typically cynical Nazi gesture, the condemned were led to believe that they were being taken to a better camp with improved conditions, a mythical place known as Dünemünde. In reality, 3,740 German, Austrian and Czech elderly, sick and children were transported to the forest north of Riga and shot. In January 1943, Roschmann was appointed ghetto commandant. Later he was given the sobriquet the Butcher of Riga by his victims. But he was not a man prone to executing people on the spot for minor offences, as had the previous ghetto commandant, Kurt Krause. Roschmann did order the summary executions of several hundred young male Jews in the aftermath of an investigation into a burgeoning resistance plot among the ghetto prisoners, and he was also implicated in several individual murders as well. Later transferred to the Lenta work camp, Roschmann dispatched many prisoners to the Riga Central Prison, where they were murdered, and considerably tightened up the regime at Lenta, which the previous commandant had kept relatively lax, as he had personally profited from the skills of the Jewish artisans and craftsmen that were imprisoned there. In autumn 1943, Roschmann was placed in charge of Kommando Stützpunkt, a work detail of Jewish prisoners that was tasked with the grim business of exhuming the thousands of bodies of the people the Nazis had already shot in the forests around Riga, and then burning them to cover up traces of the crimes that had been committed. Every 2 weeks, the entire Jewish work detail was shot and replaced with fresh prisoners. Roschmann's murderous activities came to an abrupt end in October 1944 when the Red Army broke through on the Eastern Front and rapidly advanced into the Baltic states. The only way out was by sea to Danzig, and the SS quickly shut down the concentration camps and ghettos, in some cases evacuating the prisoners along with themselves. After the German surrender in May 1945, Roschmann headed back to his hometown of Graz, in the British zone of occupation in Austria. As a former German soldier, Roschmann was soon picked up by the British military police. He was arrested and taken to an internment camp for processing as a former German soldier. Roschmann realized that he had to conceal his identity, and he managed to disguise himself as an ordinary member of the German armed forces. The sheer volume of prisoners meant that the British could not intimately examine each inmate, and Roschmann was released from custody without further interrogation. However, in the meantime, Allied war crimes investigators had identified Eduard Roschmann for immediate arrest over his murderous activities in the Riga ghetto, and they placed his wife under surveillance in Graz, hoping that Roschmann would reveal himself. This he duly did in 1947, and he was immediately arrested by the British when he knocked on his front door. This time, sure of his identity, the British sent Roschmann to Dachau, the notorious former concentration camp that was being used by the Allies as a holding centre for accused Nazi war criminals. Unfortunately, as with so many other Nazis discussed in this program, Roschmann was able to escape from custody in 1948 and go on the run. He left Germany and headed south into Italy, as so many other Nazi fugitives were to do, eventually having heard about the rat lines out of Europe that were being operated by several individuals and groups, including the Vatican. Franz Stangl avoided arrest in Graz, managing to sell the jewellery that his wife had given to him. Whilst in Graz, Stangl ran into an old Operation Reinhard colleague from his days at Sobibor, SS Oberscharführer Gustav Wagner, who had been deputy commandant at Sobibor when around 200,000 Jews had been killed. Wagner was penniless, and he begged Stangl to take him with him. Stangl and Steiner were joined by Wagner for the most challenging aspect of their escape, crossing over the Alps into Italy. The three men aimed to get to Rome, where it was rumoured that a German bishop named Alois Hudal was using his Vatican connections to help Nazi fugitives escape from Europe. The three SS men travelled 250 miles west to Murano in the Italian Tyrol, traversing the Alps. The journey was terrible, and it was only Stangel's mountaineering experience that enabled them to survive a dangerous traverse on foot of some of the bleakest and wearying terrain in Europe. Stangl ventured alone into the smart Italian tourist town of Murano to try and make contact with Bishop Hudal's representatives, but he was arrested by the police as he looked like a vagrant after the punishing mountain journey. However, Stangl was able to talk his way out of the local police station after giving the Carabinieri a story about how he had travelled south seeking work to support his wife and children back in Austria, and in the summer of 1948, Stangl and Wagner arrived safely in Rome. Steiner decided to return to Austria, where he gave himself up to the Americans. Rome at the time was teeming with Nazi fugitives, all of whom were being assisted to new lives outside of Europe by the various Roman Catholic groups that had set up rat lines to freedom. Perhaps the most infamous fugitive to pass down an Italian rat line was Dr. Josef Mengele, the former chief doctor of the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. SS Hauptsturmführer Mengele's escape from justice was legendary. In 1943, the 32-year-old Mengele had gained a notorious reputation at Auschwitz, where he had conducted medical experiments on inmates in a series of pseudo-scientific racial studies. He was particularly interested in twins, and used his time on selection duties at the railhead, where he, along with other SS doctors, decided which prisoners would live and which would be sent immediately to their deaths, to pick out twin children. Mengele had come to Auschwitz from frontline combat service as a medical officer with the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking on the Eastern Front, where his bravery in battle had been recognized with the award of the Iron Cross, 1st and 2nd class. A suave and charming man, whose homicidal instincts were normally carefully concealed, Mengele wore his military decorations with pride, and they set him apart from most of his colleagues, who were mostly career concentration camp personnel. Mengele had been badly wounded on the Eastern Front and was assigned to Auschwitz because he was no longer fit for frontline service. Surviving prisoners recalled Dr. Mengele standing at the railhead, whistling classical music and calmly directing people to their deaths with a smile. Jewish doctors, who he forced to collaborate with him in his experiments, recalled his sudden rages. He would play with the child patients in his clinic, bring them presents, and make a fuss of them. But once they were required for his experiments, Mengele would kill them without any qualms. Some 3,000 sets of twins passed through Mengele's hands during the war, and only 100 sets survived the war. By early January 1945, the Red Army was rapidly advancing through Poland, so the SS destroyed the crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau and evacuated those prisoners who were still able to walk towards the Reich. Mengele left with extensive research notes from his work on the 27th of January. He transferred to Gross-Rosen camp in Lower Silesia, where he worked as a camp doctor, and when this camp was also dissolved at the end of February 1945, Mengele worked in some other concentration camps for short periods, before joining a retreating regular army medical unit on the 2nd of May, whose intention was to surrender to the Americans. When Mengele was taken prisoner by the US Army, he did not initially conceal his identity, but such was the confusion at the time that his significance as a war criminal was unfortunately overlooked. He was released in June 1945 in possession of papers giving his name as Fritz Hollmann. From July 1945 to May 1948, Mengele, one of the most wanted Nazi fugitives, worked as a simple labourer on a farm in Bavaria. He remained in close contact with his wife and son, and with the help of an old family friend, his escape from Europe was arranged. Mengele's destination was Argentina, and he travelled, with possible assistance from the shadowy Odessa organization, via Innsbruck, Sterzing, Merano and Genoa, where he boarded a ship to freedom. In 1950, Mengele's former boss, Adolf Eichmann, went to Italy, posing as a German refugee named Riccardo Clement, finally leaving his bolt hole in northern Germany. In Italy, he was assisted by a Franciscan friar who worked for Bishop Alois Hudal of the Vatican Rat Line escape route, who handed him a Red Cross passport and an Argentinian visa in the name of Clement. With these documents, it was relatively straightforward for Eichmann to book passage on a ship to South America. On the 14th of July 1950, Eichmann did just that, and for the next 10 years he effectively disappeared below the radar of Western intelligence services and Nazi hunters, leading an unassuming life with a series of nondescript jobs. The ease with which so many important Nazi war crime suspects fled Europe in the years after the Second World War is astounding. But when the limited extent of Allied investigation teams is considered, particularly those created by the British, it is understandable how fortune favoured evil men. But what is a particularly interesting aspect of the story of the Nazi fugitives' flight from Europe is the generous assistance that was afforded to many of them by several different groups, prominent being among them the Roman Catholic Church. Bishops, priests, monks and nuns all actively assisted some of the worst mass murderers in history to flee from justice, using their Vatican protection and money to organize a well-managed series of escape routes with destinations located all over the developing world. These were the infamous and appropriately named rat lines. Episode 2. Why would anyone want to help mass murderers escape from justice? The fact that so many individuals and organizations did actively assist the escape of truly monstrous criminals after the war indicates that although Nazism was soundly defeated, many people remained fervent supporters of Hitler and his ideology. If they were not Nazi supporters, then they stood to gain from Nazi technological and medical advances, bought at the costs of mountains of corpses. Many saw no moral ambiguity in helping Nazi fugitives to flee from Europe, even when their crimes had been well publicized and they were being actively sought by investigators. The exact number and individuals and organizations that were involved in spiriting Nazi fugitives to freedom remains a difficult question to answer. It is a list that included post-war Nazi veterans organizations, agencies, the United States intelligence community, foreign governments, and perhaps most surprisingly of all, the Vatican in Rome. It was the fact that many of the Nazi fugitives either possessed information valuable to the fight against Soviet communism or skills and experience that were required by various quasi-fascist regimes around the world, and partly for these very practical reasons, thousands of wanted war criminals were assisted to freedom. Appropriately, the journeys that the Nazi fugitives took to freedom were along what were termed rat lines, escape channels that ran from the British and American prisoner of war camps in Germany and Austria, down into Italy, and thence to South America or the Middle East. In the chaos and confusion of the Nazi defeat in the summer of 1945, a huge number of high-ranking fugitives simply vanished, and in many cases they stayed vanished. Some of those who safely transited the rat lines just after the war included, as we have seen in the previous episode, SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. Josef Mengele, who was wanted for his inhuman medical experiments on children at Auschwitz-Birkenau, SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, the administrative leader of the Holocaust, Hauptsturmführer Franz Stangl, the former commandant of the Sobibor and Treblinka death camps in Poland, where over 1 million people were murdered. Other important Nazis who went down the rat lines were SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Barbie, an SD officer whose activities had earned him the sobriquet Butcher of Lyon, SS Standartenführer Walter Rauff, one of Reinhard Heydrich's closest aides and the inventor of the mobile gas vans that presaged the later gas chambers of Auschwitz, and the suave and sophisticated Hauptsturmführer Dr. Aribert Heim, who had earned the moniker Dr. Death for his experiments on prisoners at Mauthausen and Ebensee concentration camps. The involvement of the Vatican in aiding Nazi fugitives to escape from justice has been well documented over the past several decades. Several historians have made claims that the Vatican was pro-Nazi during the Second World War, and that Pope Pius XII maintained a cordial relationship with Hitler and Joachim von Ribbentrop's Foreign Office. Some have even suggested that the Vatican made little effort to prevent the Nazis from exterminating Europe's Jews, and may even have been anti-Semitic and secretly have encouraged the final solution. What can be established beyond any reasonable doubt were the activities of one particular senior Vatican figure, Bishop Alois Hudal, in aiding and abetting the escape of many prominent war criminals from justice. The Austrian Hudal, who had been born in Graz in 1885, was the rector of a seminary for German and Austrian priests in Rome. With the surrender of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's German forces in northern Italy in May 1945, Hudal and other German-speaking priests began ministering to prisoners of war who were being held inside British and American camps throughout the region. Put simply, Hudal used his position to aid the escape of wanted Nazis. He viewed the rat line as, quote, a charity to people in dire need, for persons without any guilt who are to be made scapegoats for the failures of an evil system, unquote. Prominent among those assisted by Hudal was the aforementioned Stangl and Eichmann, as well as SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. Alois Brunner, who was responsible for transporting 128,500 Jews to the camps, and SS Oberscharführer Gustav Wagner, the former deputy commandant of Sobibor camp in Poland, where 200,000 Jews were killed. When German prisoners heard that Bishop Hudal and his associates wanted to help them, many senior Nazis came forward and made contact. They had not been identified by the Allied authorities, as they had changed into regular army uniforms before capture, and often either taken someone else's identity or signed the camp registers using false names. In the confused post-war situation, with millions of Germans taken prisoner, sorting out who was going to take months, and even though Allied war crimes investigators had begun to hunt for the fugitives, most planned to get away from their camps as quickly as possible. What they required was a new identity, money, and a safe passage out of Europe to a sympathetic and, importantly, a non-extradition treaty country. Bishop Hudal issued genuine travel papers with false names to selected Nazi fugitives, as well as giving them money. The papers were official documents issued by the Vatican Refugee Organization, meaning that either Hudal was illegally using Vatican documents to further his own agenda, or he was merely an agent of the Pope and carrying out Vatican wishes. The documents were not passports, so the Nazi fugitives could not leave the country, but they could be used to obtain a displaced person's passport from the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and then such a passport could be used to apply for visas to foreign countries. The ICRC was supposed to perform background checks on those who applied for Red Cross passports, but the word of a priest, and especially a prominent bishop, was good enough for the Swiss bureaucrats. In such a manner were several prominent Nazi fugitives given new identities and travel documents by the Vatican, allowing them to simply disappear from Europe. Other priests were involved in another ratline operation, also based in Italy. A small but influential group of Croatian Catholic priests of the Franciscan order, led by Father Krunoslav Draganovic, established a similar organization to that run by Bishop Hudal, headquartered in the San Girolamo Seminary College in Rome. A ratline operation ran from Austria all the way to the Italian port of Genoa. The San Girolamo rat line initially aided former Ustashi to escape, Croatian black-shirted fascists who had collaborated with the Nazis in persecuting the Jews. Prominent among the evaders was the wartime Croat dictator Ante Pavelic. The fugitives were assisted by the priests across the border from Austria and then hidden, often in Vatican properties in Italy. Once their travel documents were ready, the fugitives were spirited to Genoa, where passage had been booked for them on board ships leaving for South America. When the British military police wanted to search the San Girolamo monastery based on good intelligence that wanted war criminals were hiding inside, the Vatican simply refused the request. The British could do nothing, as Vatican City was a neutral nation and was not subject to Allied occupation or controls. Inevitable though it may seem, and even though the British tried to sever the San Girolamo rat line, one of the major reasons for its continued successful operation was covert American assistance. In the summer of 1947, US military intelligence used the San Girolamo rat line to evacuate some of its own people. These were Nazis who had gone to work for the Americans straight after capture, often in return for immunity from prosecution for their wartime crimes. The Soviet Union was demanding that the US hand over hundreds of Nazi war criminals so that they could face justice for the crimes they had committed in Russia, but the Americans were determined to use these men for their own ends as the Cold War began to hot up. Chief among the groups of Nazis who were sent down rat lines by American intelligence was scores of German scientists. Operation Paperclip would witness the Americans evacuate 765 former Nazis to the United States for use in the American weapons and space programs. The reason why America was able to land a man on the moon in 1969, only 24 years after the defeat of Germany, was simply because of the huge number of Nazi scientists it captured and secretly shipped to the United States. Because they had been permitted to experiment on humans in the concentration camps, they had pushed the boundaries of understanding regarding what the human body could stand. This data was fundamental in getting men into space as fast as possible. The Soviets did the same thing with the Nazi scientists that the Red Army had managed to capture. Paperclip was a Joint Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency operation that had been authorized by President Harry S. Truman in August 1945. Famous scientists including Wernher von Braun, the inventor of the V-2 ballistic missile used against Britain, Arthur Rudolph, and Hubertus Struckhold had their backgrounds bleached by US intelligence, and false employment histories were provided for them. Many of the 765 Nazi scientists taken to America had been involved in human experimentation, and had also employed Jewish slave labor on their wartime projects, but all of this was simply erased from their files. One good example of the American attitude to Nazi war criminals was the case of Dr. Kurt Blomer. During the war, Blomer had held the posts of Deputy Reich Health Leader and Plenipotentiary for Cancer Research in the Reich Research Council. The cancer research was a cover for his real research, chemical and biological weapons. Based at the University of Posen in occupied Poland, Dr. Blomer ran a research institute copied from the infamous Japanese facility at Pingfan in Manchuria, known as Unit 731. The Germans and the Japanese exchanged personnel between these two facilities, and data and samples. At both Dachau and Auschwitz concentration camps, Blomer was permitted to conduct experiments on humans. Inmates were infected with plagues and malaria, and research was conducted into cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. Some prisoners were murdered by exposure to tabun and sarin nerve agents. Dr. Blomer fled Posen just ahead of the Red Army in March 1945, but before he had time to oversee the destruction of the facility, which was captured intact by the Soviets. It was obvious to the Soviets that the Nazi medical personnel at Posen had been conducting human experiments. Dr. Blomer was placed before a tribunal for his life at the famous doctor's trial in Nuremberg in 1947. Surprisingly, Blomer was acquitted of all charges against him. It has been surmised that Blomer saved his neck from the gallows by agreeing to provide information to the Americans about the experiments that he had conducted on humans, and to advise them on developing their own germ warfare program. In 1951, he was actually formally employed by the Americans at a research facility in West Germany. Once the Americans had gathered all the information they could from Dr. Blomer, he was handed over to the French, who put him on trial for war crimes and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. Blomer died in 1969. Many of the German scientists taken to America never faced trials, and the last paperclip Nazis only died off in the early 21st century, many of them honored by the United States for their scientific achievements. For example, Werner Dahm, a research rocket scientist who had helped build the V-2, was awarded the NASA Exceptional Service Medal in 2003 for his contributions to the American space program. He died in Alabama in 2008, aged 90. Although most of the paperclip personages were scientists like Werner von Braun, some very unpleasant Nazis nevertheless gained the protection of the United States. It was not only the US that wanted to use Nazi technical knowledge and military know-how in the immediate post-war period. Several countries actively recruited Nazi fugitives, and one set up a rat line network in Europe, once again using the Catholic Church as a front for such operations. Argentina was ruled by the populist dictatorship of Juan Perón, and recent research by historian Yuki Goni has demonstrated that Perón vigorously encouraged Nazi and fascist war criminals to move to Argentina. In January 1946, Argentine Bishop Antonio Caciano, Bishop of Rosario and leader of the Argentinian chapter of Catholic Action, flew to Rome to be anointed cardinal by the Pope. Founded in Italy in 1867, Catholic Action is an organization that tries to encourage a Catholic influence on society. Whilst in Rome, Cardinal Caciano met with French Cardinal Eugène Tisserand, who had passed to him a message from Perón asking for French fascists to move to Argentina. Shortly after Caciano's visit to the Vatican, a number of French war criminals who had been members of the Vichy collaborationist government arrived in Argentina. They had been issued passports by the ICRC office in Rome, duly stamped with Argentinian tourist visas. The first war criminal to arrive was Eugène Duretin, who was later sentenced to 20 years hard labour in absentia by a French court. Proving a direct link between the Pope and Hudal's rat line has proved elusive. Monsignor Karl Bayer, a senior Vatican cleric who admitted to the author Gitta Sereni in the 1970s that he had cooperated with the rat line, stated that Pope Pius XII actively supported the efforts to save wanted Nazis. The Pope did provide money for this, in driblets sometimes, but it did come, stated Bayer. The Germans had long established intelligence networks in South America. SS Hauptsturmführer Siegfried Becker was Himmler's most successful agent in the region, a man with 31 aliases and codenames. Friendly contacts were maintained with certain governments in the region, including that in Buenos Aires, Argentina. In February 1946, President Perón appointed an anthropologist, Santiago Peralta, as immigration commissioner, and former German Foreign Office agent Rodolfo Freude as his intelligence chief. These two men set up a rescue team of Secret Service agents and immigration advisors, many of them wanted war criminals themselves, to move Nazi fugitives to Argentina so that they might benefit the nation. Further evidence of the extent of Nazi influence in Peronist Argentina include SS Hauptsturmführer Carlos Fuldner, an Argentinian of German descent, who organized escapes from offices in Madrid, Genoa, Rome, and Bern. Freude coordinated the network of intelligence and immigration officials from his office inside the Casa Rosada, the Argentinian presidential palace. It was a very well-organized people smuggling network that was officially sanctioned by the Argentine government and which the Vatican tolerated, if not directly supported with cash. Yuki Goni is the first historian to successfully prove a link between fleeing Nazi rat lines and the Argentine government. The example of SS Hauptsturmführer Walter Kutschmann, who had been responsible for the murder of thousands when he was Gestapo chief in a Polish city, and was a close friend and travelling companion of the fashion designer Coco Chanel, demonstrated Goni's theory. The famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal identified Kutschmann in Argentina, and he was duly arrested on the 28th of June 1975. He had escaped to Argentina dressed in the robes of a Carmelite monk. Kutschmann was released by the police shortly after his arrest because his case dossier was lost by the court. It was discovered 5 years later inside the judge's safe. When Kutschmann had applied for a taxi driver's license, Goni discovered that his application had been supported by none other than Fernando Imperatriz, a member of President Perón's personal staff. Kutschmann died a free man in Argentina in August 1986. Goni was lucky to have discovered the information that he did, for in 1955, Peronist officials had literally made a bonfire out of most of the immigration records of Nazi war criminals, hoping to cover their tracks when their government fell. However, enough cards survived to enable Goni to draw some powerful conclusions about Perón and the Nazi rat lines. Quote, by entering the data from the index cards alone into a computer spreadsheet, Goni found that the files for Erich Priebke, for example, a wanted Nazi war criminal from Italy, and Dr. Josef Mengele were numbered consecutively, even though they arrived in Argentina 7 months apart. Unquote. Goni dug deeper and discovered more startling evidence. Quote, at the time of their applications, the Immigration Office was opening new files at a rate of over 500 per day. Thus, a single person must have applied on behalf of both war criminals at once or processed them together, prima facie evidence of an organized effort on behalf of Nazi fugitives. The question remains as to why Perón actively courted Nazis and encouraged extensive immigration into his country. From August 1946 until the early 1950s, nearly 300 war crime suspects legally entered Argentina, many of them on papers provided by Bishop Hudal or Father Draganovic in Italy, still more through the networks established by Carlos Fuldner and his associates. Perón was not a Nazi, and although his government has often been accused of having been fascist, this is not absolutely correct. Perón was a populist leader with an extremely flexible ideology who made alliances with communists and Jews, as well as fascists. Nazism was not particularly popular among the Argentine military and the right wing, largely because it was so anti-church. Argentinian sympathies were more overtly expressed towards Italian and Spanish fascism, which respected the Catholic Church. The reason for the active courting of Nazis was probably simple expediency. It was no secret that Nazi scientists and engineers had led the world from the latter part of the war, developing revolutionary jet aircraft, submarines and ballistic missiles, Hitler's vaunted V or Vengeance weapons. Perón wanted skilled labour and advanced technology of his own country, and in this desire he mirrored attempts by the Allies to use German technical expertise to give them an edge over their Cold War rivals. The aforementioned Operation Paperclip was the prime example of American duplicity with respect to the prosecution of war criminals. Over 3/4 of the 765 German scientists, engineers and technical personnel who were brought to the United States were former Nazi Party members or had been active members of the SS. All were granted immunity from prosecution for war crimes, even though the majority had Jewish blood on their hands. The Americans simply granted blanket immunity from prosecution to the teams of Japanese military doctors and scientists from the infamous Unit 731 facility in Manchuria as well, and had developed deadly plagues and chemical and biological weapons, and in the process murdered tens of thousands of Chinese, Russian and Allied prisoners of war and civilians. As in the case of Klaus Barbie, the United States was not averse to using Nazi war criminals as intelligence agents during the early stages of the Cold War, when German war crimes suspects found protection by working for the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC, a forerunner of modern military intelligence in America. One notorious operative was former SS officer Baron Otto von Boschwing, who had been a senior aide to Adolf Eichmann. Perón had a plan to allow the immigration into Argentina of 4 million Europeans at a rate of 30,000 per month during the immediate post-war period. Although this never happened, the Nazis that did come enabled Perón to produce his own jet fighter in 1947, a remarkable achievement for a South American nation then and now. Still other organizations were at work in Europe after the fall of Nazi Germany, moving fugitives to safe countries and into new lives. One of the most nefarious and mysterious groups that has been identified was the Organization of Former Members of the SS, more popularly known by its initials, Odessa. Immortalized in Frederick Forsyth's novel of the same name, which has Odessa planning the creation of a Fourth Reich, fierce controversy has raged within the historical and journalistic communities for decades as to whether Odessa actually ever existed, and if it did, the exact extent of its organization and power. The famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal asserted that Odessa was set up in 1946 to aid fugitive Nazis by the war criminals themselves. The German television station ZDF, in its investigation, and former SS men have both claimed that Odessa was never a single worldwide secret organization, but rather several organizations, some secret and some overt, that cooperated with Bishop Hudal's Vatican rat line, and others run by Latin American governments, and even the American CIA. Franz Stangl, the former Treblinka camp commandant who escaped from Europe down a rat line to Brazil, claimed that Odessa did not exist. Indeed, there is no smoking gun document that proves the existence of Odessa, as the author Gita Sereny, who interviewed Stangl at length, discovered in 1974. Quote, "The prosecutors at the Ludwigsburg Central Authority for the Investigation into Nazi Crimes, who know precisely how the post-war lives of certain individuals now living in South America have been financed, have searched all their thousands of documents from beginning to end, but say they are totally unable to authenticate Odessa." Sereny continued, "Not that this matters greatly. There certainly were various kinds of Nazi aid organizations after the war. It would have been astonishing if there hadn't been." Unquote. In Forsyth's novel, The Odessa File, a young German journalist called Peter Miller doggedly hunts for the butcher of Riga, Eduard Roschmann. Forsyth had been stuck for ideas in 1970 following the runaway success of The Day of the Jackal, and he was under pressure from his publisher. Racking his brains, Forsyth remembered hearing of a shadowy Nazi organization during his time as a journalist in Germany. The name was Odessa. From this fact, Forsyth constructed his story of a manhunt, where Miller comes up against the sinister Odessa and exposes their diabolical plans. Initially, Forsyth did not have a particular name in mind for the Nazi camp commandant. That came during a visit to Vienna in the offices of Simon Wiesenthal. The great Nazi hunter suggested that Roschmann would make the perfect villain, and Forsyth had to agree. "I thought it a great breakthrough, because here was a man who wouldn't dream of suing me for libel in the High Court," he said. Roschmann was, as we will see, then in hiding in Argentina. Of more importance than the plot of an excellent thriller is the impact the story has had on the public and on the acceptance of Odessa as a real organization. The historian Guy Walters, author of Hunting Evil, has written that, quote, "The Odessa File is responsible for the promulgation of the notion of an organization called Odessa," unquote. The former OSS officer and member of the United States War Crimes Commission, Joseph Wexberg, stated in 1967 that in his opinion the Nazis planned a Fourth Reich as the Third Reich collapsed. All over the world, but particularly in South America, there existed close-knit German communities, with many outright Nazis living among them. These German colonies would prove extremely useful to the Nazi fugitives. Quote, "The Nazis decided that the time had come to set up a worldwide clandestine escape network. They used Germans who had been hired to drive US Army trucks on the Autobahn between Munich and Salzburg for the Stars and Stripes, the American Army newspaper." Unquote. Wexberg was in effect outlining yet another rat line. Quote, "The couriers had applied for their jobs from the US Army under false names, and the Americans in Munich had failed to check them carefully. Anlaufstellen, ports of call, were set up along the Austrian-German border. In Linden, close to both Austria and Switzerland, Odessa had set up an export-import company with representatives in Cairo and Damascus." Unquote. There is a problem with Wexberg's presumption that Odessa existed in that prominent Nazis like Franz Stangl and even Adolf Eichmann denied its existence, perhaps for obvious reasons, and Heinrich Himmler's diaries make no reference to the creation of the organization, which is strange, as Himmler commanded the entire SS empire and he should have been informed. Gita Sereny hypothesizes that although some Nazi organizations did exist that did help some fugitives to escape, many others escaped justice due to post-war chaos and the inability of the Vatican, the Red Cross, and the US military to verify the claims of people who came to them asking for help in obtaining fresh documentation. Bishop Alois Hudel was probably the prime mover of Nazi fugitives throughout southern Europe, helping many to get to safety in South America, but he was definitely not Odessa. Perhaps Frederick Forsyth was nearer to understanding the true nature of Odessa 40 years on from writing his best-selling thriller. The time when he undertook detailed research across Europe for the Odessa file, Forsyth believed that Odessa was a real organization. Today he views it as a less formal arrangement. Quote, "There was undoubtedly what they would have called a Netzwerk, a net, but it's like the old boy network, the old school tie. To say it doesn't exist isn't true. It's a case of helping out so-and-so, he's fallen on hard times." Unquote. Other agencies and organizations have been implicated in aiding and abetting the escape of Nazi fugitives, aside from the Vatican, Odessa, the Argentine government, and US military intelligence. The Gehlen organization was one such group. Major General Reinhard Gehlen was Nazi Germany's foremost military intelligence chief, and after his capture by and cooperation with the Americans, Gehlen was permitted to form his own intelligence organization in West Germany to assist the US in its fight against the Soviet Union. The organization contained large numbers of former Abwehr military intelligence officers, and some SS and Gestapo as well. Wiesenthal claimed that the Gehlen organization worked in cooperation with both the CIA and Odessa, helping many former Nazis to evade justice. This is probably not true, and more an invention of Wiesenthal, who was an outrageous self-promoter. The Gehlen organization definitely formed the nucleus of the modern German intelligence organization, the BND, and Gehlen actually directed it from its creation in 1956 until his retirement in 1968. Wiesenthal also identified several other shadowy organizations that he believed were Odessa, such as Spinner, Spider, and Sechsgestirn, constellation of six. On the 9th of July 1979, a car bomb aimed at killing French Nazi hunters Serge and Bete Klarsfeld in Paris came with a note purporting to be from Odessa, though this remains speculative. Other organizations have existed in post-war Germany that some have postulated were or are fronts for Odessa, or are in some way connected with the shadowy organization. Die Stille Hilfe für Kriegsgefangene und Internierte, Silent Assistance for Prisoners of War and Interned Persons, is one such candidate organization. It is still known as Stille Hilfe or Silent Help and came officially into existence in Munich in 1951, though it probably had existed covertly since at least 1946. Created by Helene Elisabeth, Princess von Iseberg, it is known that Nazi fugitives Dr. Mengele, SS-Standartenführer Walter Rauff, Johann von Leers, and Adolf Eichmann used silent help to escape to South America. It appears that the organization had links with Bishop Hudal and the Vatican Rat Line, as well possibly with the Odessa. It is a non-profit organization that is still in existence today, and Princess von Iseburg was chosen as its first president because of her good contacts in German aristocratic and conservative upper-middle-class circles and with the Roman Catholic Church. The founding members were SS Standartenführer William Spengler, the head of the department in the Reichsmain Security Office, and SS Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Malz, who had been a personal advisor to Himmler's deputy and chief of the RSHA, Dr. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. In the 1990s, Silent Help was still pulling in annual donations that ranged between 60 to 80,000 euros, and its present 40 or so members have been led since 1992 by Horst Jansen. One of the more prominent modern members of Silent Help until recently was Gudrun Burwitz, Heinrich Himmler's daughter. She was an outspoken supporter of neo-Nazi politics until her death last year. Another organization begun in the early 1950s was Mutual Help Association of former Waffen-SS members, which was known by its initials as HIAG. It may have had links with the Odessa and Silent Help, and at its height in the 1960s, HIAG had over 70,000 members. It provided assistance to SS veterans, and was particularly vocal in campaigning for a rehabilitation of veterans' status with respect to war pensions. Unlike those who served in the regular German armed forces during the war, former SS members have been denied pensions by the German government because the SS was the military arm of the Nazi Party and had been declared an illegal organization by the Allied occupation authorities in 1945. HIAG was disbanded in 1992. The operations to get Nazi fugitives to safety were astonishingly successful in the immediate post-war period, and stand as a grim indictment of the inability of the Allied powers to prevent the escape of so many suspected war criminals. According to historian Paul Manning, in total, down all of the rat lines that operated in post-war Europe, about 10,000 former German military personnel successfully found sanctuary in South America. Several thousand more went to the Middle East, while many former SS men joined the French Foreign Legion, where few questions were asked of their war records and backgrounds. Many were killed fighting in French Indochina during the 1950s, during the bloody prelude to the Vietnam War, as France desperately tried to restore its colonial authority over a rebellious and well-organized local population that was equally determined to establish independent communist republics. Some of the Nazi fugitives remained at large for decades. Some were identified by Nazi hunters, but because no extradition treaties normally existed between Germany and the nations where the fugitives resided, they could not be returned home for trial. Other methods were attempted by the Israelis, such as kidnap and murder, to mete out some measure of justice to the mass murderers who were living free and often high on the hog in their adopted countries. Some fugitives died as free men, while even today a tiny handful remain alive and will probably never answer for their crimes before the courts. The eventual fates of several high-ranking Nazi fugitives who have subsequently died will be revealed in the next episode, as well as the fascinating stories of those who were recaptured and sent to Europe or Israel for trial. Episode 3 is an audio-only episode for War Stories with Mark Felton. Once safely ensconced in South America, most of the wanted Nazi war criminals sought to keep as low a profile as possible. Although they were relatively secure among the dictatorships, most continued to use false names and papers, and sometimes to change addresses or even nations every few years in an attempt to throw off any would-be pursuers. But for many of them, getting to South America involved a rather circuitous journey, usually via the Middle East, a journey that often lasted many years. Franz Stangl had arrived in Damascus, capital of the French Protectorate of Syria, in September 1948. Bishop Alois Hudal had already lined up a job for Stangl, working in a textile mill. Former Sobibor Deputy Commandant Gustav Wagner also arrived in Damascus at the same time as Stangl and quickly settled into a quiet life. Stangl was determined that his wife Theresa and their 3 daughters would be reunited with him as soon as possible, and he worked hard and carefully saved money for their passage out of Austria via Italy. In May 1949, the Stangl family was reunited in Damascus. Theresa's exit from Italy had been problem-free and very easy, even though it was known that she was the wife of a major war crime suspect. The Stangl family settled down to a period of great happiness and well-being. Franz was free from the fear of capture and punishment for the time being. The family lived relatively well for a short period, and the Stangl's marriage improved markedly. But then, quite suddenly, Stangl lost his job when the owner of the textile mill he was working for died. For some time, Stangl found it very difficult to find suitable work, and instead, Theresa took up the financial burden of the family and worked as a masseuse. The family lived in a boarding house that was full of Germans who were living in Syria under assumed names, indicating that they were, in all probability, also Nazi fugitives. Stangl was never sure, as everyone was careful not to speak to each other very often and to always use assumed names when they did. In December 1949, things changed for the better when Stangl found a job as an engineer with the Imperial Knitting Company. The family was able to move into a large and comfortable flat in the old part of Damascus. But the unwanted attentions of a neighbor towards Stangl's 14-year-old daughter convinced him that it was time to move on from Syria. He decided to go to South America, and Theresa was dispatched to visit the various South American consulates to discover which nation would accept Stangl and his family. Brazil was the most welcoming, and Stangl, identifying himself as an engineer, applied to emigrate. His application was accepted, and the Stangls sailed for Santos in Brazil via Genoa in Italy under their real names. Stangl had to pay for the relocation out of his personal savings, and it meant that when the Stangls arrived in Brazil, they were once again almost broke. Swallowing his pride, the man who had once been an SS officer and camp commandant with the power of life and death over hundreds of thousands of people instead went to work in another textile mill for the next 2 years. In the meantime, also building a house in the Sao Paulo suburb of São Bernardo do Campo. In the meantime, many other Nazi war criminals were already living in South America. Argentina in particular was rapidly filling up with wanted fugitives, as was President Juan Perón's desire, many of them assisted by Bishop Hudal and his Vatican ratline. One of the most notorious fugitives, who was definitely aided by Hudal to escape, was a Prussian aristocrat and the son of a general, Ludolf von Alvensleben. He had commanded the West Prussian Selbstschutz, or self-defense paramilitary forces during the German invasion of Poland in 1939. The Selbstschutz operated in cooperation with Einsatzgruppen shooting units, and they were tasked with exterminating a large number of Poles who were considered to be a threat to Nazi overlordship, including Jews, the nobility, teachers and professors, communists, military officers, and so on. Von Alvensleben's units killed at least 4,247 people before the Polish campaign was over, and the methods used were deliberately cruel and sadistic. A former adjutant to Heinrich Himmler, von Alvensleben went on to command SS security police, the Sicherheitsdienst or SD units in the Crimea after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, where he ordered many more crimes against humanity to be committed by his men. In April 1945, von Alvensleben had been captured by the British and sent to the Neuengamme internment camp, from whence he had escaped. He fled with his family to Argentina in early 1946, assisted by Vatican papers provided by Hudal and others on the ratlines. Nothing more was heard about von Alvensleben until the 27th of November 1952, when President Perón granted him Argentine citizenship under the appropriate name Carlos Luca. Perón appointed von Alvensleben an inspector of fish farming in Hererosee. Von Alvensleben lived in Buenos Aires until July 1956, when he moved to the town of Santa Rosa de Calamuchita, where he was fondly remembered by many of the older locals even today. In January 1964, a court in Munich issued an arrest warrant for von Alvensleben for the murders of the people I already spoke about while in command of the Selbstschützen in Poland. The Argentinians, having no extradition treaty in place with West Germany and having no wish to turn von Alvensleben over to face trial, simply ignored all representations that were made to them from West German diplomats. Von Alvensleben died on his birthday in 1970, a free man in Argentina. In February or October 1948, Eduard Roschmann, former commandant of the Riga ghetto in Latvia, emerged at the other end of a rat line in the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires. There he found work in an import-export company and kept a low profile. He bigamously married again in 1955, though the marriage was annulled less than 3 years later. Then, in 1968, Roschmann achieved what should have been security for life, Argentinian citizenship, under the false name of Federico Wagner. Already efforts were underway to identify and capture Roschmann. In 1959, a warrant had been issued in West Germany for his arrest for the crime of bigamy. A year later, the Austrians finally got their act together and issued an arrest warrant for Roschmann, citing him for the murders of at least 3,000 Jews between 1938 and 1945, for having been an overseer of forced labourers at Auschwitz concentration camp after his flight from Latvia, and for the murder of at least 800 children below the age of 10. Unfortunately, Austria was notorious for its inability to actually take such a prosecution anywhere, and that was left to the West Germans. In 1963, the Hamburg District Court issued an arrest warrant for Roschmann for a variety of war crimes. The problem was that Roschmann was safely ensconced in Argentina, a country which, at the time, was not disposed to cooperating with hunts for Nazi war criminals. It took until October 1976 before the West German embassy in Buenos Aires made a formal extradition request to the Argentine Foreign Ministry. Thinking that it was a rather futile gesture considering that Argentina did not have in place an extradition treaty with West Germany, the Germans nonetheless repeated the request in May 1977. To the great surprise of not only the West Germans, but also the Argentine Foreign Ministry, the Office of the President announced that Argentina would consider the Roschmann extradition request. It has been suggested that at the time Argentina was facing a fair amount of criticism concerning its internal human rights record, and many elements of the government were perceived as anti-Semitic. Handing over the butcher of Riga would have gone some way to restoring the Argentine government's reputation. But they made the mistake of not placing Roschmann under arrest and duly tipped off about his likely fate. Should he have chosen to remain in Argentina, Roschmann fled across the border into Paraguay. In the capital, Asunción, on the 8th of August 1977, Eduard Roschmann apparently died. The body remained unclaimed for some time, and there was great speculation, including from the famed Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, over whether Roschmann was in fact really deceased. Nothing further has been heard of Roschmann since, so it is fairly safe to assume that the man who died in Asunción carrying identity documents in the name Federico Wagner was Roschmann. Suggestions that Roschmann had murdered someone who fitted his age and appearance, or that this was done by some shadowy Nazi organization like the Odessa, stretches the limits of credibility and is probably best relegated to fiction. Roschmann was not a senior Nazi, nor was he particularly well off. What he had become was a man who had been on the run for 3 decades, and that killed him. Justice finally caught up with Adolf Eichmann on the evening of the 11th of May 1960, outside the entrance to his modest house on Garibaldi Street, Buenos Aires. Amid dramatic scenes, Eichmann was kidnapped by a crack squad of Israeli secret agents. Eichmann had been actively hunted by the Jewish people throughout the 1950s, and in particular by Wiesenthal. In 1954, Wiesenthal had received reliable information that Eichmann was living and working in Buenos Aires. Information had also been received by the Mossad, Israel's intelligence organization, and on this basis they launched a long drawn-out operation to identify and then kidnap Eichmann so that the administrative brain of the Holocaust could be placed on trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann, travelling on documents that had been issued to him by Bishop Hudal, found employment almost as soon as he arrived in Argentina. Posing as Ricardo Clement, Eichmann was assisted by former SS officer Carlos Fuldner and began work at an Argentinian-German hydroelectric firm called Capri that was located 500 miles northeast of Buenos Aires, close to the small town of Tucumán. Eichmann was junior management and diligent and efficient enough at his job to be quickly promoted. He lived in a simple rented house, rode horses around the alpine countryside, and learned to speak Spanish. In 1951, Eichmann felt so secure in Argentina that he contacted his wife through the Nazi Old Boy network, and in June she journeyed to the Italian port of Genoa with their 3 sons. The boys all travelled using their father's real surname, while Eichmann's wife used her maiden name for the voyage. If intelligence agents had been watching the family, they could have followed them direct to Eichmann's hideaway in Argentina. Living in Buenos Aires in July 1952, the Eichmann family was reunited. It had been 5 years since Eichmann's wife had seen him. However, in early 1953, Capri went bust, and in April, Eichmann moved his family back to Buenos Aires, where he rented a bungalow in the rather shabby Olivos district of the city. Times were tough for the Eichmanns, and each business that Adolf tried failed, including a laundry, a fabric shop, and a rabbit farm. Eichmann's despair was only lifted by the birth of his 4th son, Ricardo, in 1953. After struggling for many years, in March 1959, Eichmann gained a job as a mechanic at the Mercedes-Benz plant that was located in the north of Buenos Aires. In 1960, the family moved into a small, one-story house that Adolf and his sons had built themselves on Garibaldi Street after Eichmann had purchased a plot of land. It was extremely basic accommodation, lacking running water and electricity. A man of routine, each evening Eichmann would alight at a bus stop 100 meters from his house and walk home. Before going into the house for his supper, Eichmann would inspect his vegetable garden and walk once around the outside of his house. It was this precise routine that enabled the Mossad agents who had been sent from Israel to kidnap him ample opportunity to plan their operation. On the evening of the 11th of May 1960, Eichmann alighted from a bus slightly later than normal. As he walked towards his front gate, he noticed an American car was parked about 20 meters from his house. The bonnet was up, and several men were tinkering with the engine. As he drew level with the car, one of the men turned and asked him something in Spanish. As Eichmann paused to reply, the man grabbed his arms, and the 2 men fell writhing into a nearby ditch. The other Mossad agents quickly hauled the terrified Eichmann into the back of the car and sped away. Within seconds, Eichmann realized that his kidnappers were Jews. Smuggled out of Argentina aboard a specially chartered El Al flight, Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem for his crimes. On the 1st of June 1962, the 56-year-old Eichmann was hanged, his body cremated and his ashes scattered over the sea to make sure that there would never be any memorial to the man who had killed millions of Jews with a signature. The former Treblinka commandant Franz Stangl was an Austrian, so it was the responsibility of the Austrian authorities to have hunted him down and brought him to justice. But Vienna did absolutely nothing until 1961, when an arrest warrant was finally issued. By this time, the crimes that Stangl had committed at the Sobibor and Treblinka camps were very well known, so it is difficult to understand why the Austrians had not issued a warrant many years earlier. Unlike most of the other Nazi fugitives, Stangl had made absolutely no attempt to hide his real identity since he had arrived in Brazil from Syria. In August 1954, Stangl had even registered his details with the local Austrian consulate. The reason why the Austrians failed to spot Stangl was probably because his surname was quite common, and although the crimes that had been committed in the camps that had been under his command were well known, the name of the commandant was not. Guy Walters, in his book Hunting Evil, even suggests that Austrian diplomats may have been involved in concealing Stangl's location, protecting him in effect from efforts to apprehend him. However, there is no proof that the Austrians were colluding with Nazis. Rather, the evidence seems to indicate that they were simply disinterested in hunting down their fellow countrymen for crimes that were committed in a period the Austrian people were very keen to put behind them. So, the Austrian authorities sat on their hands and did nothing to further the apprehension of Franz Stangl. Instead, it was the Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal who provided the authorities with proof that Stangl was living and working in Brazil, and this information may have come from Stangl's embittered former son-in-law Herbert Havel. Until the issue of an arrest warrant in 1961, Stangl had remained well below the radar as far as most Nazi hunters were concerned. At the end of 1955, Stangl had fallen ill with a mystery disorder. His wife, Theresa, had once again stepped into the breach and took a clerical job at the Mercedes-Benz plant in Sao Paulo. As part of his recuperation, Stangl had built a small workshop at his home and started a company that manufactured bandages for Brazilian hospitals. In October 1959, Stangl's wife got him a job with Volkswagen through her contacts in the local German motor trade. Stangl began as an engineer, but he was soon promoted to head of preventative maintenance and earned a commensurate high salary. Both salaries enabled the Stangls to move into the better Brooklyn district of Sao Paulo, where Stangl built another house. His attitude to being captured was fatalistic. "If it comes to it, I want to give myself up. I don't want to run away," said Stangl to his wife. Registering with the Austrian consulate under his real name proved that Stangl had no intention, unlike Eichmann and Dr. Mengele, of becoming a true fugitive. He almost seemed to want to be caught. Between October 1964 and August 1965, the Treblinka trial was held in Düsseldorf, West Germany. The event was widely reported in the world's media, and at the conclusion of the trial, 8 former SS men were sentenced to prison terms, ranging from 4 years to life. Stangl's name was obviously at the forefront of the trial, as he had commanded the camp. But even though he was living under his own name in Brazil, and he had registered his name and personal details with the Austrian consulate in Sao Paulo, and kept a regular correspondence with friends and family back in Austria, no one reported the location of the man who was being held responsible for murdering 900,000 people. When Adolf Eichmann was kidnapped and put on trial in Jerusalem, Stangl followed the case with great interest. He avidly read the Viennese newspapers and even bought books about Eichmann, though the subject was taboo between members of his family. Fellow murderer Dr. Josef Mengele, when he read about the Eichmann trial, immediately feared for his safety and began plans to flee to another non-extradition country. Franz Stangl did not flee. Instead, he just continued going to work at Volkswagen like the good and efficient worker that he had always been. One man who was on Stangl's trail was Wiesenthal. He claimed later that his first tip-off about Stangl's location had come from a cousin of Stangl's wife, Theresa, who, Wiesenthal claimed, visited him at his office in Vienna. Some historians doubt the story and believe that it was fabricated by Wiesenthal in order to cover up the more mundane reality of where the tip-off had actually come from. The story goes that this relative of Stangl had accidentally said too much and told Wiesenthal that Stangl was alive and well and working as a mechanic in the Volkswagen factory in Sao Paulo. Wiesenthal also claimed that another former Nazi came to see him seeking money in exchange for information. After negotiations, the seedy former Gestapo man told Wiesenthal that Stangl was living in Sao Paulo. In all probability, the person who really tipped Wiesenthal off about Stangl's location was Stangl's former son-in-law, Herbert Havel, who had already threatened Stangl with exposure in the early 1960s after an unhappy breakup with one of Stangl's daughters. With Wiesenthal popularizing the case against Stangl, the West German government asked the Brazilians to extradite Stangl to stand trial, and the Brazilians fully cooperated. Stangl was arrested by federal police on the 28th of February 1967, ignominiously dragged from his car outside his house after returning from a bar with one of his daughters. On the 22nd of June, he was extradited to West Germany to stand trial for the murders of 900,000 men, women and children. During the course of the trial, Stangl admitted his role in the killings, but he mounted what has come to be known as the Nuremberg defense, after so many Nazis had claimed that they had simply been following orders during their trial before the International Military Tribunal. "My conscience is clear," stated Stangl from the dock in 1970. "I was simply doing my duty." Unfortunately for Stangl, at Nuremberg this form of defense had been ruled inadmissible because all soldiers have the right, under international law and the accepted rules of war, to refuse any order that they have deemed to be immoral. There can be no more immoral order than that issued by Himmler for the killing of 1 million civilians, orders that Stangl had enthusiastically followed without question. Unsurprisingly, Stangl was found guilty on the 22nd of October 1970, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. If he had been tried just after the war, he would have been hanged at the time. On the 28th of June 1971, Stangl died of heart failure at the age of 63, whilst he was serving his sentence inside Düsseldorf prison. Just a few hours before he suddenly died, Stangl had granted the author Gitta Sereny one final interview. Sereny felt it was the closest Stangl ever came to taking responsibility for the terrible crimes that he had perpetrated. "In reality, I share the guilt," said Stangl, "because my guilt only now in these talks, now that I have talked about it all for the first time." Dr. Mengele had continued to lead a charmed life in South America, socializing on the edge of cafe society, while Adolf Eichmann had led a life marked by much more straitened financial circumstances, loneliness and isolation. He showed no remorse for his terrible crimes. Mengele's letters and notes confirmed that his cultural and political consciousness remained stuck in 1945 and that he was never able to recognize anything reprehensible about the atrocities he committed in his human laboratories at Auschwitz. He believed that he was simply killing people who were already sentenced to death. In Buenos Aires, Mengele had initially worked in construction soon after his arrival from Italy, and then he had used family money and bought into a pharmaceutical company, taking a 50% share in Fadro Farm. He had divorced his first wife and married again to Marta Mengele, the widow of his younger brother. The wedding had taken place in Uruguay, and then Marta and her 14-year-old son Dieter had moved in with Josef. Whilst in Argentina, he maintained contact with other high-profile Nazis, including Hans-Ulrich Rudel, one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces, who had been awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, Germany's very highest gallantry decoration. Mengele set up a clinic where he had practiced, among other things, illegal abortions, and he was even briefly arrested by the police after one of his patients had died. When Adolf Eichmann was kidnapped from outside of his house in Buenos Aires by Israeli agents in 1960, Mengele feared that he would also be targeted. He was right to be afraid, for the Mossad had actually identified him, and they had decided not to snatch him then and there, as they still had Eichmann in a safe house in the city, and they could not safely smuggle two well-known Nazi war criminals out of the country at the same time without being discovered by the authorities. A Mossad agent had even physically seen Mengele on the street, which was how close the Israelis came to apprehending him. Mengele responded to the very real threat by immediately leaving the country and moving to Brazil, and then on to Paraguay, where he obtained a Paraguayan passport in the name of José Mengele. He lived in the German colony of Hohenau. The Paraguayan dictator, General Alfredo Stroessner, was of German descent, and he actively recruited Nazis to assist his government. After a while, Mengele moved back to Brazil and became a farm manager outside Sao Paulo in the small town of Nova Europa. He lived on a farm owned by the Stammers, Hungarian immigrants who did not know Mengele's true identity, but of course guessed that he was probably a Nazi fugitive. In 1974, Mengele's relationship with the Stammers came to an end. His increasing paranoia about being kidnapped by the Israelis made him a difficult and argumentative employee. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, who was an integral part of the Nazi Old Boy network in South America, suggested to Mengele that he might like to move to Bolivia and live near Klaus Barbie, the wartime SD leader in France and butcher of Lyon, who was also a former American Counterintelligence Corps intelligence asset. Mengele declined, and instead he moved into a modest bungalow in a Sao Paulo suburb. In 1977, his son Rolf, from his first marriage, secretly visited him in Brazil, but he was stunned to discover that his father was very much an unreconstructed Nazi, who was keen to justify his experiments on children at Auschwitz. Mengele died aged 67 while swimming in the sea off Bertioga, Brazil on the 7th of February 1979, either from drowning or after suffering a stroke. He was buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard, an alias that Mengele had been using since 1976. In 1985, West German police, who had issued an arrest warrant for Mengele decades before, raided the house of a Mengele family friend in the doctor's hometown of Günzburg. There they discovered large amounts of documentation pertaining to the 3+ decades that Mengele had spent on the run, including details of his burial in Brazil. On the 6th of June 1985, the Brazilian authorities permitted Mengele's supposed grave to be opened and the human remains inside to be exhumed and sent for tests. Forensic examinations concluded that the remains were most probably those of Josef Mengele. In 1992, a DNA test on the remains confirmed that they were indeed Mengele's, and the question of his survival was settled once and for all. Mengele had managed to remain on the run for 34 years. In a gruesome twist to the story, Mengele's skeleton remains in storage today, the Sao Paulo Institute for Forensic Medicine, because the Mengele family have refused to take the bones from the Brazilian authorities. In a way, Mengele's skeleton is representative of the history of Nazi fugitives. For like the doctor's bones, the story has yet to be fully laid to rest, as many Nazis remain on the loose, even 7 decades after the end of the war. Tune in next time as we move the hunt for Nazi war criminals into the 1980s and beyond. Episode 4, written and narrated by Mark Felton. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Nazi fugitives continued to die off in South America. Although they were actively hunted by both European governments, the Israelis, and interested private citizens, only one prominent Nazi war criminal was dragged back to Europe to face justice for his extensive crimes. The rest found protection and shelter under the umbrella of dictatorships or continued to move around regularly, thus throwing their pursuers off their scent on several occasions. Franz Stangel's former partner in mass murder, SS Oberscharführer Gustav Wagner, the former staff sergeant and second-in-command of the Sobibor camp in Poland, had escaped from Europe with his old commanding officer just after the war, after their journey had been made possible by Vatican officials. On the 12th of April 1950, Wagner had become a permanent resident of Brazil under the name Günther Mendel. Whereas his old boss, Stangl, had been arrested by the Brazilian police in 1970 and extradited to West Germany, tried and imprisoned, Wagner led a more charmed existence. Wagner remained at large in Brazil for most of the 1970s, but on the 30th of May 1978, he too was arrested by the police. Extradition requests had been lodged with the Brazilian authorities from the governments of Israel, Austria and Poland, but these had been rejected. On the 22nd of June 1979, an extradition request from West Germany was also rejected. Wagner was fully aware of all these legal machinations against him, and he endeavored to remain one step ahead of the law. In October 1980, Gustav Wagner was found dead in an apartment in São Paulo, having been killed by a knife wound to his chest. His lawyer claimed that Wagner had committed suicide, though murder has not been discounted in this case. After all, it appeared to many of the interested parties that Wagner could count on Brazilian judicial indifference to protect him from extradition. And it would not have been the first occasion when Nazi fugitives had been murdered. The Israelis had done so on at least one occasion, when they had ordered the Mossad to carry out the murder of Herbert Kukurs, a Latvian national hero and member of the Einsatzgruppen, who had personally slaughtered women and young children during operations by the dreaded Arash Commando in 1941. Kukurs was killed by Israeli agents in Uruguay in 1965. Another prominent Nazi fugitive who successfully avoided capture after escaping down a rat line was SS Standartenführer Walter Rauff. During the 1970s and 80s, Rauff was considered the most senior Nazi war criminal that remained at liberty. An SS colonel, his Nazi career had involved him in some of the worst crimes of the Second World War. Rauff had been an aide to Himmler's deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, from 1938 until the latter's assassination in 1942, firstly as an officer, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the much-feared SS security police. In this capacity, Rauff had commanded the SD in occupied Norway in 1940. During 1941-42, Rauff had become an integral part of the planning for the final solution, developing gas vans that were used to murder hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Soviet Union. In 1972, Rauff was questioned by a journalist about his involvement in the creation of the gas vans, and whether he had had any doubts about their introduction to replace the mass shootings that were being conducted by the Einsatzkommando units. "I cannot say," said Rauff in Santiago de Chile. "The main issue for me at the time was that the shootings were a considerable burden for the men who were in charge thereof, and that this burden was taken off them through the use of gas vans." In 1942-43, Rauff was responsible for the murder of over 2,500 Jews in Tunisia when his unit exported the final solution to North Africa in the wake of Erwin Rommel's defeat of the British at Tobruk in June 1942. By 1943, Rauff was in Milan, where he commanded all Gestapo and SD operations in northwest Italy. He was captured in May 1945, along with many other SS officers, at the Hotel Regina in Milan by British troops, who had had to break through an enraged lynch mob to free the German officers who had barricaded themselves inside the building. Rauff was sent to an internment camp in Rimini. He was identified by pro-Nazi Bishop Alois Hudal as a special case, and after escaping from the camp, he was spirited to Genoa via several Catholic convents and furnished with a set of false papers. In 1948, Rauff was in Damascus, capital of Syria, where he was recruited by Syrian intelligence and became a military advisor to President Hosni Zaim. The following year there was a coup in Syria, and Rauff was lucky to escape with his life, as those close to the old regime were murdered. Rauff fled across the border into the Lebanon, and from there to Italy, where using his false passport he gained a transit pass for Ecuador in South America. Incredibly, Rauf was assisted by the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence organization, who had been using him as a double agent to help them penetrate Arab countries. The Israelis, like the Americans, often had no qualms about using former Nazis when the political situation suited them. In 1958, Rauf next popped up in Chile, where he worked as the manager of a king crab cannery in Punta Arenas, in the far south of the country. The West German government knew where Rauf was, and they issued a request to the Chilean government to extradite him back to Europe to stand trial for his war crimes. In December 1962, Rauf was arrested by the police in Chile, and it looked as though he would be spending the rest of his life behind bars in a West German prison. But whilst he was being held in detention in Chile in 1963, the country's Supreme Court decided to reject the extradition request, and Rauf was once again a free man. The West German government put pressure on President Salvador Allende, but he refused to reverse the court's ruling. In fact, once General Augusto Pinochet had taken control of Chile, Rauf moved back to the center of power and served as an advisor to Chilean intelligence. Pinochet resisted all attempts made by the West German government to have Rauf extradited, the last occasion in 1983. On the 14th of May 1984, Walter Rauf died of lung cancer in a private hospital in Santiago, an unrepentant Nazi to the end of his days. His funeral was a major neo-Nazi event in the city, and an unpleasant reminder of the assistance such countries had rendered to the world's most wanted men. One very well publicized Nazi fugitive case that had a more satisfactory ending was that of former SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, who was successfully captured and placed on trial for his crimes. Barbie's case graphically demonstrated how a wanted war criminal had been aided by the Americans to escape from justice down a rat line. Barbie was an SD officer and had been the head of anti-resistance operations in France. He had also ordered raids on French Jews and had overseen the deportations of thousands to the camps, including most notoriously the deportation of 4 dozen young French orphans who were sent from the town of Izio to Auschwitz. Barbie remained in hiding after the war until April 1947. It has been revealed that Barbie was an agent of the U.S. Army's 66th Detachment Counterintelligence Corps, one of hundreds of former Gestapo and SD men used by the U.S. in the early stages of their ideological war against the Soviet Union. Barbie proved an excellent asset for the Americans, and for years he ran a spy network of informants in both East and West Germany and in France. The Americans trusted him. However, in 1949 the French became aware of Barbie, and they immediately, and not unreasonably, demanded that he was handed over to them so that he could face trial for the crimes he had committed in occupied France. The Americans feared that if they handed Barbie over to the French, the fact that they had employed a wanted Nazi fugitive would have reflected badly on military intelligence, and Barbie was privy to many secrets that the Americans had no desire to share with the French. Instead, ignoring the demands of their ally, the Americans turned to the rat line run by the Croatian priest Father Draganovic. By placing Barbie on the rat line, the Americans effectively granted him immunity from prosecution in France for his wartime atrocities. In 1951, Barbie successfully arrived in Argentina with his wife and 2 young children in tow, and soon after he moved on to Bolivia, where he lived under the alias Klaus Altmann. In Bolivia, Barbie lived openly and associated with the country's ruling fascist dictatorship. Although he was positively identified as Klaus Barbie by French Nazi hunters Serge and Beta Klarsfeld in 1971, the Bolivian government had no interest in extraditing him. In fact, in 1980, Barbie was part of the cocaine coup when Luis Garcia Meza Tejada seized power. Barbie worked for Bolivian intelligence, where he planned concentration camps to house political prisoners, and also formulated effective torture techniques based on his Gestapo experience in Lyon. Barbie also grew rich, managing an arms export company that diverted Belgian and Swiss weapons to Israel after the Jewish state found its arms imports embargoed following the Six-Day War. It was only another coup that led to Barbie's sudden downfall in Bolivia. On the 19th of January 1983, Barbie was arrested by the new government of President Hernan Siles Zuazo and extradited shortly afterwards to France. Barbie's return to France caused a sensation and a great deal of soul-searching as the nation came to terms with its complicated wartime record of resistance and collaboration. The reappearance of Barbie deeply embarrassed the United States, and the State Department was quick to issue a formal apology to France for delaying justice in Lyon for nearly 33 years. In 1984, Barbie was placed on trial in Lyon, but he remained an unrepentant Nazi. "There are no war crimes," he famously stated. "There are only acts of war." Regarding the French prosecution of him for war crimes, he said, "I did my duty. I have forgotten. If they have not forgotten, that is their business." On the 4th of July, he was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment. Before he was taken down to begin his sentence, Barbie stated, "When I stand before the throne of God, I shall be judged innocent." 7 years later, in 1991, Barbie died in prison in Lyon from leukemia, some small measure of justice having been achieved for his victims. Some Nazi war criminals managed to remain in the countries of their birth, and through a combination of judicial indifference and misplaced humanitarianism, they avoided real punishment. The case of former SS Oberscharführer Karl Frenzel is an excellent example. He was the third in charge of the infamous Sobibor camp, working under the command of the later South American Nazi fugitive Gustav Wagner. Frenzel arrived at the camp on the 28th of August 1942, ready to implement Operation Reinhard. Appointed commandant of Camp No. 1, Frenzel held command responsibility for the deaths of 150,000 Jews. Frenzel also personally murdered at least 6 Jews, according to witness testimonies. In 1966, Frenzel was sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes at a trial in West Germany to punish those responsible for the Sobibor deaths. After serving only 16 years in prison, Frenzel was released on a technicality in 1982, but he was rearrested and retried again shortly afterwards. Found guilty and sentenced once again to life imprisonment, the sentence was never imposed by the court due to Frenzel's supposed ill health, and he was given his freedom. This ill health did not prevent the Nazi from living another 14 years as a free man. Frenzel lived the last years of his long life in a pleasant retirement home in the town of Garbsen, outside of Hanover, where he passed away in 1996, aged 85. An even more recent case was that of former SS Standartenführer Dr. Martin Sandberger, who passed away in 2010 at the ripe old age of 98. His case demonstrated that it was not so much a case of what you know, but who you know. If ever family connections played a part in saving a Nazi from prison, it was this case. They say that it pays to have friends in high places, and Martin Sandberger had many such friends. Sandberger was the commander of Sonderkommando 1A of the Einsatzgruppen in the Baltic states. He was personally responsible for thousands of deaths, but in the end he was able to get off virtually scot-free because of his good connections among the West German ruling elite. Sandberger had had the good fortune to be born the son of a director of the giant German industrial concern IG Farben in 1911. A fervent Nazi since 1931, 5 years later Sandberger had enlisted in the SS. By 1938 he was a Sturmbannführer or major in the SS Security Police, the SD, as well as an assistant judge, a doctor of laws and a government councillor. In June 1941, Sandberger was appointed the chief of Sonderkommando 1A, part of Einsatzgruppen A, charged with following the so-called Führer order to the letter and liquidating all of the Jews that it encountered as the Germans rampaged through the Soviet Union. His unit entered Riga in Latvia in company with Sonderkommando 2 and set about destroying synagogues, murdered 400 Jews, and busily set up groups of anti-Semitic Latvians to conduct their own pogroms. In July 1941, Sandberger's unit moved on into Estonia, where his men executed by mass shootings a further 474 Jews and 684 communists, as well as large numbers of gypsies and mentally ill people. Sandberger personally sent a further 5,377 people to the concentration camps. On the 10th of September 1941, Sandberger promulgated a general order for the internment of the Jews, and his unit dispatched 450 to a concentration camp at Pskov in Russia, where they were all murdered. Sandberger's superiors were extremely pleased with his record in the Baltic states, and he was promoted to Standartenführer, or full colonel. On the 3rd of December 1941, Sandberger was appointed commander of the SD and security police in Estonia, returning to Germany in September 1943. In the autumn, Sandberger was sent south into Italy, where he became the Gestapo chief for the city of Verona, with responsibilities involving the arrest of Jews in northern Italy and the organization of their deportation to Auschwitz. Sandberger was extremely efficient and sent cattle trains east packed with men, women and children. In January 1944, Sandberger was appointed head of the SS Foreign Intelligence Service, Division A, part of the Reich Main Security Officers, Department 6. In this capacity, he was responsible directly to SS Gruppenführer Walter Schellenberg, Himmler's chief spy. Sandberger kept domestic, foreign and financial records of the organization and acted as a liaison with Himmler himself. After his capture by the British in 1945, Sandberger tried to use the secrets that he had learned while in intelligence to delay or even to avoid prosecution for war crimes. At first, this ruse was quite successful, the British, like the Americans, being more than receptive to former German intelligence operatives who were willing to reveal secrets and assist them in their fight against the Soviets. This strategy was successful until the full horrors of the activities of the Einsatzgruppen were revealed in the West, and it became politically embarrassing to keep such a prominent murderer as Sandberger out of the courtroom. At the Einsatzgruppen trials held in Nuremberg between 1947 and 1948, Sandberger was charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership of an illegal organization, the SS. Sandberger denied any responsibility for the murders that his unit had committed in the Baltic states, and he tried to shift the blame onto the German field police and unruly elements of the local Estonian Home Guard. This was rejected by the court. Sandberger also claimed to have arrested and transported the 450 Jews to Pskov concentration camp to protect them from the infamous Führer order, and that he had had no knowledge of their subsequent murder. In fact, Sandberger claimed that he was only responsible for a fraction of the killings attributed to him, at most between 300 and 350 persons. Despite the defendant's protestations from the witness stand, it is evident from the documentary evidence and his own testimony that he went along willingly with the execution of the Führer order, noted the court. Unsurprisingly, Martin Sandberger was found guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to death by hanging in September 1947. However, Sandberger had no intention of keeping his appointment with the hangman, and the court had reckoned without the support of his powerful family. The death sentence was confirmed in 1949, but still Sandberger was not executed. In 1951, the sentence was suddenly commuted to life imprisonment by a clemency board acting under the direct authority of the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, John C. McCloy. McCloy had been placed under political pressure by Senator William Langer of North Dakota. Many of Langer's constituents were of German origin, and apparently many felt that the death sentence should only have been given to the most senior Nazi war criminals, and that handing down death sentences to the more junior leaders of the Holocaust was undemocratic and un-American. However, the real pressure that probably saved Zandberger from the noose was German in origin. Zandberger's father, a retired production director at IG Farben, a company that had deliberately built their Monowitz factory close to Auschwitz to benefit from slave labor, used his considerable influence with West German President Theodor Heuss to save his son from the punishment that he deserved. Heuss contacted U.S. Ambassador James B. Conant with a request for clemency, and who was going to refuse a request emanating from a president? Certainly not the United States, keen to keep the West Germans on their side in the Cold War against communism. If there was any doubt, Zandberger's father was able to drum up considerable support from among Germany's powerful governing elite, including letters from the Minister of Justice, Wolfgang Hausmann, and politician Martin Haug. Another supporter was renowned lawyer and vice president of the West German Parliament, Carlo Schmid, who went so far as to worry about Zandberger's prison conditions in Landsberg, and who spoke out in favor of commuting the sentence to life. By late 1957, Zandberger was one of only 4 war criminals who were still behind bars in West German prisons, a damning indictment of the official lack of interest expressed by the Germans in punishing the mass murderers who were living among them. Zandberger's powerful family friends ensured that this number was soon reduced to 3 convicts, when the West German courts ordered his release on the 9th of January 1958. Incredibly, a mass murderer, whose crimes had warranted the death penalty only a few years before, was set free to live out the rest of his life in wealth and comfort, in a cynical exercise in rehabilitation through family connections. Zandberger would live another 52 years, and when he died on the 30th of March 2010 in Stuttgart at the advanced age of 98, he was one of the last senior SS war criminals who had survived into the 21st century. Tune in next time for the story of Dr. Death, the SS doctor who hid out in the Middle East for decades, hunted by the Israelis, an elusive figure wanted for horrific war crimes in the concentration camps. Episode 5, Dr. Death, written and narrated by Mark Felton. British filmmaker Dov Friedman's heart beat a lot faster in his chest as he peered intently at the very old man who shuffled towards the front door of a large house in the German spa town of Baden-Baden in 2008. Friedman was making a documentary for the BBC called The Last Nazis, and the camera had been following famed Israeli Nazi hunter Dr. Ephraim Zurov in his quest to capture the most prominent Nazi war criminal that was believed by many to still be at large. Sitting quietly in a car parked on the pretty, tree-lined residential street, 33-year-old Friedman thought that he had found his quarry. The most chilling part was the moment when we saw that old man, recalled Friedman. Zurov wasn't with us at the time because he stuck out quite a bit, being 6'2" and wearing a kippah. He wanted to get some discreet shots of the house. My director of photography said, "I'm not being funny, but there's a very old man walking into the house." We saw him and the woman with him, and we knew that she was Heim's ex-wife. There were 5 to 10 minutes when we thought it was plausible it was him. The search for former SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. Aribert Heim, known to history as Dr. Death, had taken Zurov and Friedman to Chile and Germany in their efforts to locate him, chasing leads and rumours. Hunting for Heim had become akin to searching for the Loch Ness Monster. People had come forward in Chile with recent sightings of a tall, German-speaking man who was extremely old, with a prominent scar on his cheek, a description of the Simon Wiesenthal Center's #1 quarry. Dr. Zurov knew that Heim's illegitimate daughter, Waltrud, was living in a small town in southern Chile called Puerto Montt, where local informants had said that a man matching Heim's description had been seen. The first thing I felt when I was in Chile was that this was a very good hiding place, said Friedman. Not only is it completely separate from Europe and the horrors of the Second World War, but it is separated by the mountain range of the Andes. It all seemed too good to be true, and with a reward of 315,000 euros on offer for information leading to Dr. Death's capture, a lot was at stake. Heim's daughter had finally relented to a private interview with Zurov, during which she claimed that she had never met her father and did not know anything about his whereabouts. Zurov knew that the Heim family was wealthy. Indeed, the main reason why Heim was believed to be alive at the time was the fact that his bank accounts, frozen by the West German government after he fled from Europe in the early 1960s, still contain £1.7 million that could be claimed by Heim's sons if they could prove he was dead. Even in 2010, the money remained untouched in Heim's German accounts. For many, including Zurov, the fact that no members of the Heim family claimed the fortune provided prima facie evidence that the evil doctor was still alive. Dr. Zurov was intrigued to visit Baden-Baden, the beautiful spa town in Germany where Aribert Heim had quietly practiced gynecology after the war, until he was identified as a Nazi war criminal and was forced to flee. The family home in Baden-Baden was a huge white Victorian building in a quiet, leafy suburb, where Heim's ex-wife still lives. Zurov realized, after he saw the house, that Heim could have been financially sustained by his family with ease during the almost 50 years that he spent on the run from justice. Perhaps Heim had even returned to live incognito in his former home in Baden-Baden, hoping that he would be free to live out his remaining years in freedom and peace after hoodwinking the world about his whereabouts for decades. Zurov had been told that a tall, very old man lived in the property. It almost seemed too easy, but the lead proved to be yet another trail gone cold. "We showed Zurov the footage, and he didn't think it was Heim," said Friedman. No one's seen a photo of him for 40 years. The man Friedman filmed turned out to be the new husband of Heim's ex-wife and another tall, retired doctor. "There were moments in the 12-month period when I thought we may actually find this guy," said Friedman. "But you do get a bit carried away when you're that close to it." In March 1979, Dr. Heim wrote, "As early as 1961, I was warned that I had no reasonable chance to endure a fair concentration camp trial, because if only one witness would have testified against me, the person who warned me said, 'This will be taken as the truth.'" Heim was at pains to point out in the written rebuttals to the charges of war crimes levelled against him from the 1960s onwards that he was innocent of the lies of the witnesses who had spoken out as early as 1946. What had Aribert Heim done to earn himself the name Dr. Death at Mauthausen concentration camp? According to the witness statements, and to Nazi hunters like Ephraim Zurov, Heim was nothing more than a sadist who enjoyed inflicting pain upon helpless Jewish inmates for no medical reason. Unlike Dr. Josef Mengele, who inflicted terrible suffering in the course of what was for him a genuine medical research program, however perverted and immoral, Heim's activities were not even dressed up as Nazi research. One of these sadistic acts that has followed Heim around since Mauthausen was his penchant for removing inmates' heads so that he could use the skulls as desk ornaments. The 6'4" tall Heim had trained as a doctor in Vienna, qualifying in 1939. Born in the Austrian town of Radkersburg, Heim's father, Josef, had been a district commander in the gendarmerie. On the 17th of April 1940, Heim had reported for training with the SS Reserve Battalion Deutschland in Munich, and according to a handwritten resume that Heim wrote decades later, he had served in the invasion of France as a mere car driver. On the 1st of August 1940, Heim had been commissioned as an SS Untersturmführer in the medical battalion in Prague, and he later worked in the Red Cross Hospital's surgical department in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. Heim was transferred back to Germany in April 1941, where he was attached to the Oranienburg concentration camp outside Berlin, claiming that he was an assistant in the surgical department. He remained at Oranienburg until the 19th of June, when he transferred to Buchenwald concentration camp as a troop doctor of the soldier guards, as he put it. The day after he arrived at Buchenwald, his elder brother was killed in action in Crete, where he was serving as a Luftwaffe paratrooper. Heim's next posting, on the 14th of July 1941, was to the Reserve Battalion of the elite Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Regiment at Berlin-Lichterfelde, the Führer's Lifeguard Regiment, where he was a medical officer. Heim claimed in his resume that in October 1941 he was loaned out to the Mauthausen concentration camp, where his responsibilities were as a medical officer supporting the guards, and as a surgeon in the camp infirmary treating inmates. Heim claimed that he was only at Mauthausen for 7 weeks, but those 7 weeks would lead him to becoming notorious in the camp system and earn him the moniker Dr. Death. It has been claimed that Heim worked closely at Mauthausen with the camp pharmacist, SS Obersturmführer Dr. Erich Wasicki, particularly in a series of experiments that were seemingly conducted to test how quickly a human heart could be stopped with a variety of different substances. Heim was accused of having murdered large numbers of patients by injecting into their hearts various poisonous substances, including petrol. Wasicki was a fellow Austrian who was instrumental in the selection and murder by gassing of inmates both at Mauthausen and at the Schloss Hartheim Institute, where the Germans ran their illicit T4 euthanasia program under the supervision of Franz Stangl. Wasicki, who served at Mauthausen between 1941 and 1944, was intimately involved with Walter Rauff's gas truck experiments in mass murder conducted as part of the T4 program. 12,000 people were murdered in the gas trucks, while a further 3,100 perished in the gas chamber at the Hartheim Institute. Wasicki was the SS doctor who was charged with the establishment of the gas chambers at Hartheim and Mauthausen, and it was Wasicki who actually delivered the metal canisters of Zyklon B to the SS NCOs, who dropped the crystals through a vent in the roof of the chambers to kill those inside. As a pharmacist, the 30-year-old Wasicki was obviously extremely well placed to assist Dr. Heim in his alleged experiments at the camp hospital in 1941. Wasicki did not manage to flee at the end of the war, and he was charged with murder by a U.S. military tribunal in 1945. On the 13th of May 1946, Wasicki was found guilty, and on the 28th of May 1947 he was hanged in Landsberg prison in Germany. Less than a year after Dr. Ephraim Zuroff and Dolf Friedman had been jetting between Chile and Germany on the trail of Aribert Heim, a man handed an old and dusty brown leather briefcase to a representative of the New York Times in Cairo, Egypt. When the contents of the case were examined, it appeared that the mystery of Heim's existence on the run had been solved, and that Heim had died over a decade before. German police experts were eventually permitted to travel to Egypt to check out the story, and a careful forensic examination of the briefcase and its contents was conducted. Analysis of dust showed the briefcase had been in North Africa for a number of years, confirmed the German police. They also confirmed that the handwriting on the documents inside was indeed Heim's. Heim's son, Rüdiger, had earlier claimed that his father had settled in Cairo and had died in the city in 1992 of rectal cancer. Rüdiger claimed that he had been at his father's side when he died. Even more interestingly, Rüdiger claimed that Heim had converted to Islam and that he had changed his name to Tarek Hussein Farid and had spent the last decade of his life living in the Casa El Madina Hotel. The family who used to own the hotel, the Domas, discovered the briefcase in Heim's apartment and kept it, later handing it over to the New York Times. The briefcase contained a treasure trove of documents, including handwritten articles penned by Heim on a subject he appears to have become obsessed about, the 13th tribe, or the Khazar Empire, and he had penned a report on anti-Semitism. About the last subject one would have associated with a Nazi war crime subject. His typed report, written in English, carefully lists the number of Jews in the world between 1939 and 1947, taking into account the 6 million who were exterminated by the Nazis, the total number of Semitic Arabs, and the total number of the people in Palestine in 1918. And then Heim created a mailing list for the distribution of his report, including world leaders and American elected officials. The general thrust of Heim's research appears to have been the disproving of the purported Semitic ancestry of a people he calls the Khazars, or non-Semitic Jews. According to Heim, the Russian Khazars' descendants live in the United States and form the, quote, Jewish lobby, unquote. Heim seemingly wanted to expose them as fraudulent Jews, writing in a covering letter that the recipients of the report, quote, should be aware of the true history facts and not hide their identity, unquote. Also stuffed into the case were Heim's rebuttals of the charges made against him by Jewish survivors of Mauthausen, a resume he had written outlining his life until the 1950s, visa documents under the names of Ferdinand Heim and Tariq Hussein Farid, and an Egyptian death certificate issued under the latter name in 1992. There was even a copy of an article from the German magazine Der Spiegel, which was published in 1979, discussing his wartime activities in the camps, in which Heim had carefully underlined passages that he disagreed with in red ink, adding the German word for slander in the top left-hand corner. I am glad that it has been confirmed that my father lived in Egypt, and I am very optimistic that there will be an official confirmation of his death in the near future, said Rüdiger Heim. Confirmation has been a long time coming and remains pending. Based on the documents found in Heim's briefcase, confirmation of his death would appear to be a straightforward matter, and one would have expected Rüdiger and his brother to have claimed their father's frozen fortune, but this has not occurred. Handwriting analysis has confirmed beyond all doubt that the written documents in the case were penned by Aribert Heim. His photo appears on Egyptian residency papers issued between 1963 and 1967 in the name Ferdinand Heim, and the passport numbers, place of birth, Radkersburg, Austria, and date of birth, June 28, 1914, match Heim's, and, importantly, also exactly match a set of Egyptian residency papers that identify a German named Tariq Hussein Farid from 1982, also found in the case. A death certificate for Farid, issued on the 10th of August 1992, is also usefully part of the contents of the case. If further proof were required of the identity of Ferdinand Heim, the briefcase also had several bank receipts recording money sent to the National Bank of Egypt to Aribert Heim by his sister Herta Barth in December 1970. We don't doubt the suitcase belonged to Heim or that he was in Egypt, said Ephraim Zuroff in 2009. We do not agree there is evidence that he died there. There is no body, no burial place, no proof that he died in Egypt. Dr. Zuroff has pointed out on several occasions that if Heim is indeed dead, why then has the 1.7 million euros sitting in a German bank account not been claimed by his family? The Heim briefcase and its collective documents has about them the whiff of a setup. Perhaps Heim was moved, with the assistance of his family, from Egypt to some other undisclosed location, perhaps even to Chile, where he has a daughter and a son-in-law, and the briefcase was disclosed in an attempt to throw Nazi hunters like Zuroff off the scent. We shall return to the missing body alluded to by Dr. Zuroff momentarily. Certainly, Dove Friedman had his doubts. It's a murky story, he said. There are so many uncertainties. Rudiger claimed Heim had converted to Islam and was living in Cairo. It was almost just too perfect, as there's no one to confirm the story. Egypt is notorious for being a difficult place to penetrate. We tried to get to Cairo to confirm the story, but we had our visas denied." Unquote. Inside the briefcase, written in German, was a detailed rebuttal of all the accusations of war crimes that had been made against Heim by Jewish survivors of Mauthausen. Quote, "Just imagine this accusation of having, just out of boredom, forced young people to undergo surgery in order to intentionally cause their deaths by removing vital organs, such as heart, liver, spleen, and bowel, with the aim of possessing skulls for personal purposes," wrote Heim on the 19th of March 1979. "What crueler deed could accuse me a doctor of than these brutalities and bestialities?" Unquote. Heim was particularly incensed by the accusations made by famed Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal. Quote, "In 1978, Wiesenthal said on television that when I took these organs from these people, I had operated on them even without anesthesia, i.e., I treated them worse than a butcher when he kills animals. One would have had to strap these victims all around the operating table, and the cries of the victims would have reverberated through the camp." Unquote. Heim told his son Rudiger that he had even considered voluntarily returning to Germany in 1979 so that he could clear his name at a trial, but he came to believe that the Jewish victims' testimonies would prove too conclusive, and he would have to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Another document, written in English, carefully outlined Heim's daily duties at Mauthausen, where he attempted to portray himself as a simple army doctor, performing the duties that he had been assigned. Quote, "My work began at 8 o'clock in the morning, with the treatment of the soldiers in the troops' quarter, which was outside of the inmates' camp. The treatment lasted about 2 hours. Then it followed the treatment of the inmates in the infirmary station of the camp, achieving small surgery, as carbuncles, abscesses, and a visit to the sick room of the infirmary. With that, the morning time from 8 to 1 o'clock was passed." Unquote. In Heim's statement, the afternoons at Mauthausen were equally straightforward and non-controversial. Quote, "In the afternoon it followed too the treatment of the soldiers and a visit to the sick room of the infirmary. Occasionally I took smear checks in the camp's brothel, and I visited ill persons of the soldiers' families." Unquote. Heim only admitted to performing 2 major surgeries during the 7 weeks that he was at Mauthausen. Quote, "Additionally, I achieved 2 emergency operations, namely an appendectomy at a girl inmate of the brothel and an operation, hernia and intestines, of a 70-year-old male inmate who died directly after the operation due to a circulatory disorder." Unquote. Heim strongly rejected that the camp was even in the business of killing its inmates. Quote, "During my stay in the months October-November 1941 in the camp, it has not existed a secret order for euthanasia for sick and disabled inmates. Selections were not achieved. Likewise, poison injections were not delivered." Unquote. Heim was emphatic in his denials of having done nothing wrong, although all of his rebuttals concerning war crimes appear to have been made whilst he was in hiding and living under a false name. The Nuremberg defense had been legally rejected decades before. Quote, "I was ordered to the camp Mauthausen as a doctor for the soldier guardians, and did only serve by way of a makeshift in the camp infirmary. I was not responsible for events in the camp infirmary which could happen without my presence, because I was doctor for the soldiers only." Unquote, he wrote in broken English. The last statement is contradictory, as Heim had already admitted that part of his duties was treating inmates as well as guards. Quote, "All other events in the camp reported in the prosecution are for me so new, as they were new for the investigation authority. This I declare herewith in lieu of an oath." Unquote. Heim wrote that he left Mauthausen on the 24th of November 1942 and was posted to the SS Field Hospital in Vienna. For 9 months throughout 1942, Heim records that he served as a doctor for the medical examination board that selected young men for the SS, and on the 1st of September 1942 he was promoted to SS Obersturmführer, or lieutenant. Like Dr. Josef Mengele, Heim also saw combat, and for just over 2 years he served with the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord on the Eastern Front, primarily in northern Finland, during which time he was wounded in action. Heim was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class for his bravery under fire, as well as the Infantry Assault Badge and the Wound Badge in black. Promoted to SS Hauptsturmführer, or captain, on the 20th of April 1944, Heim served on the Western Front in the Vosges Mountains in France from the 1st of January 1945 until he was captured by the US Army on the 15th of March. In common with many other Nazi war crime suspects, Heim was not placed on trial whilst he was a prisoner of the Americans. In the confusion that reigned after the end of hostilities, and with literally millions of German prisoners in their hands, war criminals found it relatively easy to claim to be different people from different branches of the armed forces. Heim stated that he worked as a prisoner doctor in American POW camp hospitals in France in 1945 to 46, and was later interned in Germany in 1947 before being released. By 1948, Aribert Heim was practicing medicine at Bad Nauheim and Jagstfeld in Germany, as well as being an active member of an ice hockey club in Bad Nauheim. Interestingly, Heim always made sure that he was out of frame when any team photographs were taken. Other than this precaution, Heim appeared not to live in fear of arrest for his wartime activities. Between 1950 and 1962, he practiced at the Women's Hospital in Ludwigshafen and later in Baden-Baden, and published several papers on gynecology in medical journals under his own name. On the 14th of January 1957, Heim had become a German citizen, and he was rich enough that the following year he bought an entire apartment building in Berlin, the rents maintaining him in some style in his large Baden-Baden property. The money that Heim made in the 1950s and 60s constituted the 1.7 million euros sitting in frozen German bank accounts, and which can only be claimed by his sons if it is proved that Heim is dead. Heim himself had no access to his money since the late 1970s, and received financial assistance from his family and other unknown sources. Heim first became aware that he was being sought for war crimes in 1961, when his name came up concerning witness statements from Mauthausen survivors. His escape from justice the following year was more by chance rather than by design. Heim had continued to practice medicine in Baden-Baden, but he had been warned that he would not get a fair trial by fellow former Nazis. Nevertheless, I did not want to believe this and stayed at home, wrote Heim in 1979. In the fall of 1962, it was only sheer coincidence that the police could not arrest me because I was not at home at the time. It appears that Heim was in Frankfurt from May 1962, and it was in that city that he wrote out a new will dividing his assets between his 2 sisters and 2 sons, as he was now divorced from his wife. This document was found inside the dusty briefcase in Cairo in 2009. According to the documents discovered in Egypt, Heim made his first residency application in Cairo in 1963 under the name Ferdinand Heim. Ferdinand was Heim's middle name. It also appears from the documentary evidence that Heim was able to live off the proceeds of the rents collected at the large Berlin apartment building that he owned, until the West German government froze his accounts in the late 1970s. Bank receipts discovered in 2009 clearly showed that Heim's sister was sending him money. So what of Heim's years in hiding in Egypt? The Egyptian government remained hypersensitive regarding having sheltered Nazi war criminals, and they flatly denied that Dr. Death was ever a guest in their country. It's nonsense, said General Hamdi Abdel Karim of the Interior Ministry in 2009. There was no evidence he was here. It's a fabricated story. The Egyptian government certainly has as shady a past regarding giving sanctuary to Nazi fugitives as South American nations like Argentina and Brazil. Heim found himself in familiar company when he sought shelter in Cairo in the 1960s, for many Nazis were already working for the Egyptian government. Among the Arab nations, many leaders viewed the German assault on the Jews to be acceptable, and also helpful in solving the Palestine problem. In February 1945, with the German defeat inevitable, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon and Saudi Arabia had all declared war on Germany, largely so that they could qualify for membership of the new United Nations. Their governments remained, for the most part, fairly pro-Nazi, and like Perón's Argentine government, they resolved to use Nazi fugitives for their own ends. Whereas Perón had wanted scientists and engineers, President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt wanted Dr. Goebbels' propaganda experts, commenting, "We will use the services of those who know the mentality of our enemies." The term enemies Nasser used when referring to the fledgling Jewish state of Israel, which bordered Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula. Nasser opened Egypt's doors to Nazi fugitives, refusing all requests to extradite them for trial in Europe, including requests that were made by his Soviet and Eastern European allies. In 1953, when rumors circulated that Hitler was still alive, a prominent Egyptian newspaper invited prominent citizens to publish letters to the Führer. Anwar al-Sadat, who was later president of Egypt between 1970 and 1981, wrote, "My dear Hitler, I congratulate you from the bottom of my heart. Even if you appear to have been defeated, in reality you are the victor. You succeeded in creating dissensions between Churchill, the old man, and his allies, the sons of Satan." President Nasser gave sanctuary to some very unpleasant Nazi war criminals. Franz Bartel had been the assistant chief of the Gestapo in the Polish city of Katowice. By 1959, he was working for the Department of Jewish Affairs in the Egyptian Ministry of Information in Cairo and using the name El Hussein. His former boss, SS Standartenführer Rudolf Mildner, was also in Cairo. Mildner had also been the head of the political department at Auschwitz, where he had interrogated prisoners. During his period in charge, he had over 2,000 Poles executed. In September 1943, Mildner was appointed Gestapo chief in Denmark, but the Jewish population was forewarned of the planned German roundups, and most of them fled to neutral Sweden. Following this failure, Mildner was transferred to the city of Kassel, before heading the SD in Vienna, and finally in the Austrian city of Linz, before he was captured by the US Army in May 1945. Mildner testified at the Nuremberg trials against his boss, Dr. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and after being released in 1949, he fled to Egypt to avoid prosecution for war crimes. Also working for the Egyptian government was former SS Untersturmführer Wilhelm Böckler, who had played a prominent part in the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1944. In Cairo, he worked for the Israel Department in the Ministry of Information. Medical men were also well represented. Alongside Heim was Dr. Hans Eiseler, formerly the chief doctor at Buchenwald concentration camp, and he died in Cairo in 1965. Former SS Gruppenführer Alois Moser became an instructor of paramilitary youth groups in Cairo, and Erich Altern, using the name Ali Bella, former regional SD chief in Galicia, was recruited as an instructor at Palestinian terrorist camps. The list of ex-Nazis in Egypt was long and remains deeply embarrassing for the Egyptian government, hence the blanket denials. The anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli government that Colonel Nasser led in Egypt even embraced Nazi ideology. For example, in 1959, the Institute for the Study of Zionism was created in Cairo. It employed several former Goebbels propaganda men, including Louis Haydn, who translated Hitler's book Mein Kampf into Arabic. The books were then distributed as free gifts to Egyptian army officers. It also maintained contacts with neo-Nazi groups, including Britain's National Front. Regardless of official denials from Cairo, the evidence that Heym was in the city in the past is overwhelming. Journalists interviewed several local people who all remembered a tall German who was still recalled with some affection by those who knew him, including the Doma family who owned the hotel where Heym was supposed to have lived for over a decade until his death. According to the Egyptians who knew him, Heym would walk the bustling streets of Cairo for hours each day, visiting the Al-Azhar Mosque and dropping by the J. Groppi Cafe, where he would order cakes to be delivered to his friends and buy sweets for their children. The children would address Heym as Uncle Tariq. Mahmoud Doma, the son of the owner of the hotel where Heym resided, said, "He was like a father. He loved me and I loved him." Doma recalled a man who was kind, neighbourly, and who spoke Arabic, English, and French beside his native German, a man who studied a German language copy of the Quran, and a man who loved children. In the summer, Heym bought tennis rackets and a net and set up a makeshift court on the hotel roof where he would play with Doma and the other children until sundown. The most troubling aspect of the story of Aribert Heym in Egypt is not his life in Cairo, but the circumstances of his reported death and the disposal of his body. "It was during the Olympics," stated Heym's son Rudiger after his father's passing in 1992. "There was a television in the room and he was watching the Olympics. It distracted him. He must have been suffering from serious pain." Medical documents discovered in Heym's Cairo briefcase show that he was undergoing treatment for rectal cancer from 1990 until his recorded death. The death certificate issued for Tariq Hussein Farid records him as being 81 years old, when Heym was actually 78 in 1992. According to Rudiger, his father had left instructions that his body was to be donated to medical science, but that this request was extremely difficult to be carried out in a Muslim country, where the body must not be desecrated, and it must be buried very quickly. Instead, Rudiger recounted that his father's friend Mahmoud Doma and himself bribed a hospital official to take the body to the Doma family crypt, but that when the authorities found out, they forced Rudiger to have his father's body wrapped in a white sheet and sealed inside a plain wooden coffin interred in an unmarked common grave in Cairo. If true, there is absolutely no way that investigators can ever find Heym's remains for DNA testing, in the same way as the remains of Josef Mengele were tested to finally confirm his death and halt the ongoing hunt for him. It is more than likely in 2020 that Dr. Heym is indeed dead, otherwise he would be at least 104 years old. But unravelling the mysterious circumstances of his death remains very, very interesting. The subsequent activities of Rudiger Heym have raised more than a few eyebrows in the Nazi hunting community. In the summer of 2008, Rudiger tried to have his father legally declared dead so that he could inherit the large sum of money held in the frozen German bank accounts. Rudiger claimed that he would donate the money to charity. After the discovery of the briefcase full of documents in Egypt that have subsequently been authenticated by the German police as having belonged to his father, Rudiger told reporters that he would try again to have his father declared dead. The Simon Wiesenthal Center's head Nazi hunter, Dr. Zuroff, said the latest development in the hunt for Aribert Heym has raised, quote, "more questions than it answers. There's no body, no corpse, no DNA, no grave. We can't sign off on a story like this because of some semi-plausible explanation. Keep in mind these people have a vested interest in being declared dead. It's a perfectly crafted story. That's the problem. It's too perfect." Unquote. Guy Walters, in his book Hunting Evil, has stated that, in his opinion, Heym died in Egypt in 1992. He expended many pages of his book to criticizing the late Simon Wiesenthal, and he has a similar attitude towards Wiesenthal's successor, Dr. Ephraim Zuroff. The Nazi hunters' July 2008 trip to Argentina and Chile in a final attempt to determine whether Heym was still alive, Walters dismisses as, quote, a publicity exercise in order to promote the Wiesenthal Center, the main activities of which are fighting anti-Semitism and defending Israel. Nazi hunting is a minority activity for the center, but it is a useful brand builder, unquote. Walters asserts that Zurov's refusal to accept the proof of Haim's death in Cairo is based upon his selfish desire to keep Haim alive in the public imagination because, quote, dead Nazis can no longer be hunted, and without something to chase, Nazi hunters will soon be out of work, unquote. Walters' comments do not take into account the many younger Nazi war criminals that Zurov has exposed. So the question remains unanswered today. Did Dr. Aribert Haim die in Cairo in 1992? Did he perhaps move somewhere else, probably Chile, as is suspected by Nazi hunters, and live on a few more years before succumbing to extreme old age? This particular mystery may never be solved. You have been listening to Ratlines, The Hunt for Nazi War Criminals, written and narrated by Mark Felton. For video documentaries on a wide range of military history topics, visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions, details below. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, which is very much appreciated. Please see the description box for details.